Hello and welcome to Cinema to the Letter. This episode, it's that A for Atypical, known as Last Action Hero. On Cinema to the Letter, we break down the very nature of cinema letter by letter. For each episode of a film miniseries topic, we cover 6 films that fit either a C for classic, I for an indie, N for new, E for egregious, M for masterpiece, and A for atypical. Who doesn't love an acronym, am I right? I am Thomas here, or actually I am the character Jack Shredder from the Last Action podcast series. And Thomas and Ryan will also appear later on in the episode by himself.
And hi, I'm Bryan, but I'm the famous comedian Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Oh, perfect. Oh, I can't believe there's another special guest, truly, we would want to have on the show. But not that guest. Not right now, because we do have a guest, our first ever guest on the show here, Bryan.
Yeah.
We'll go ahead and introduce him. You might know him from our home at Talk Film Society, editor-in-chief, a guy who puts us podcasters to shame. We take breaks. We're going to be taking a break after this episode. That's not his deal. That is not Mr. Marcelo J. Pico's deal. Marcelo, thank you for opening up your busy schedule to be our first ever guest.
Thanks for having me, guys. Happy to be here, and I'm here as myself. I'm playing Marcelo J. Pico. So
you're at the premiere for the podcast where we're going to bump into
exactly.
Just like, I can't believe it. Planet Hollywood, am I right?
Yeah. I mean, my wife likes Arnold Schwarzenegger. I don't like Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Amazing. We'll talk about all that. But yes, Marcelo, in case you weren't aware based on his clever, subtle references that we were all doing here, we are talking about Last Action Hero tonight as our atypical, which I would argue fits that. A very atypical blockbuster, especially for the time. I mean, later on, this is more a dime a dozen now with your Deadpools and all your meta things. But this is back in the day, 30 years ago almost to the day.
Jesus. And
it was 30 years a few weeks ago.
In June,
in June, yeah. I mean, it came upon us, the 30th anniversary. I know we'll get into it. I know this whole episode is about this movie, but it doesn't feel 30 years old. That's what I'll say.
Yes, very true, very true. But yeah, before we get into the movie, though, there's one big thing we have to talk about right off the bat, because it's very crucial to this discussion, which is the career of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Very crucial to this whole
big guy too.
This is very big guy, obviously, yes. And I'm curious, especially from Bryan, because Bryan and I, we've talked about this. There's an age difference, so I'm very curious. What is your relationship with Arnold Schwarzenegger in particular?
When I was growing up, he was kind of doing like the Expendables. Like that was kind of the era that I unfortunately had to grow up with of his career. And then, I went back and watched like Terminator and kind of the classic ones. And like just last year, I watched a bunch of just the ones that I hadn't seen. Like I had never seen Total Recall, and I watched like The Running Man, Commando, and just those ones that you don't really, aren't the sort of big Arnold movies. But
Arnold has various
themes,
for sure.
Yes, he does. But he's just, I don't know. He's a classic movie star. I always kind of like just thought of him that way, and he's also just such a funny man. Just watch his movies. He's funny when he isn't meaning to be necessarily, but he's such a classic movie star and a classic action star, especially, which I love him. I love him in movies. He's just so great to see.
And Marcelo, our guest, what is your relationship with Mr. Arnold Schwarzenegger?
Yeah, I'm very curious.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up when he was the biggest movie star around. I remember vividly one of the first experiences I had watching a movie was watching the first Terminator. It's like that was one of the first VHSs my parents had. and it played, nonstop because I love the first Terminator, even as a kid. And then T2 was huge in my house growing up. And then when I was a teenager, I gravitated towards like his other work, like Total Recall. Like that was a favorite of mine back in the day. And I saw him grow into. He became the governor. Yes. That happened for a bit, and then he became, gradually what he is now, sort of like a postmodern, action star who is still dabbling in it, but. He's. I think he himself has come to terms with how he's kind of like grown beyond, what he was in the '90s, which is good, I think. And I haven't seen that documentary that delves into his life. I'm interested in that, but I think he's, controversies aside, I think he's great. Yeah, and I was happy to rewatch this because it reminded me of just how great of a superstar he was, and he still is, and how great of an actor he is. So yeah, I'm totally a big fan of Schwarzenegger.
This is very interesting because I'm literally like sandwiched right in between the two of you. Because like I grew up basically during the period where like I was watching the first Arnold movies mostly on like DVD or VHS or whatever. So when I was a kid, I was seeing stuff like Terminator movies and all these other things. I'm like, oh my god, he's amazing. I love this guy. Why isn't he so big? Like everyone knows he's like so big, right? And I think the weird thing is he was, but at this time when he was making stuff like, End of Days and The Sixth Man or whatever, right before The Sixth Day, sorry, but right before like he became governor, basically, he was mostly known as like a parody of himself, which is very interesting given this particular movie. Like I think more people who were my age knew him from like parodies on, say, The Simpsons, Rainer Wolfcastle, who was also weirdly Schwarzenegger in the movie for some reason. It still weirds me out. Just like, it's Rainer Wolfcastle, we know this. The Simpsons has been on for fucking 20 years, whatever. That. And then, Animaniacs had, like, the big dog guy that was buff, Hans and Franz, and SNL. Like, then it's interesting, because I think that was all, obviously, a thing ever since he started, pretty much, with, like, Terminator. There were parodies of Arnold. But I think, weirdly, it ramps up in the wake of this particular movie, which I think is a good transition. Let's play the trailer here for Last Action Hero.
Columbia Pictures is proud to present the screen's greatest action hero, Jack Slater.
Don't even think it, Slater, you hear me?
This is the Lieutenant Governor.
Slater, here's what I... The governor gets here, call me.
And Danny Madigan is his biggest fan.
Jack Slater 4.
But tonight, a magic ticket...
It's a passport to another world.
...will get Danny closer to the action than anyone ever dreamed.
Holy cow! I'm in the movie!
Who the hell are you?
Don't shoot me! I'm Danny Madigan, I'm a kid!
And you're going with him.
Who is this twerp, and where is that smile on his face?
I don't even know these kids.
To a world that's bigger than life.
This ticket is magic, and it really works.
And better than real.
You really believe that you're inside a movie, don't you?
Yes!
Arnold Schwarzenegger is Jack Slater.
No!
This hero stuff has its limits.
And Jack Slater is...
Everybody down! Now!
The last action hero. The big ticket for '93.
I'll be back. Ha! You did not gonna say that, did you?
That's what you always say.
I do?
So Last Action Hero came out June 18th, 1993 from, we're going to avoid controversial figures to who've done anything wrong. John McTiernan, who is another fascinating person, just in terms of, like, the career we could go on about, just, like, because this comes after his 80s, where, he has done Predator, Die Hard, then early 90s, you've got Hunt for the Red October, and something like that. Amazing. Medicine Man, which isn't great, but has a cameo as a VHS in this movie at one point. But then, he does this, which is, in case you're not aware, sort of a parody of action cinema that he had kind of helped create in this era, sort of in the 80s. And I guess before we get into the movie, just briefly, McTiernan. I mean, we have thoughts. One of the most fascinating director careers of all time.
He's such a fascinating director. It's weird because I have only seen his action movies of like that classic period. So all the ones you just mentioned up until Die Hard with a Vengeance, which is Die Hard 3, right?
Yes,
it's the weird one with like Sam Jackson and like who's the villain in that one? It's
Jeremy Irons as the brother of Alan Rickman's character.
Yes. A great movie, but yes, he's one of my favorite action directors of that period. His sort of style of just like his action scenes are just filled with just gunshots and glass and like paper flying everywhere. Just so like it's chaotic. It's just absolute chaos, and he's just so great at what he did. Well, he was great at what he did at the time, and
he may still be coming back. There's those rumors now that he's like out of prison. He'll be doing a new movie allegedly, but I don't know. Who knows?
Yeah. But yeah, I'm very curious to hear what you guys' thoughts are on McTiernan.
I mean, for me, I love the man. He directed one of my favorite movies of all time, Die Hard, which I still think is the greatest action movie ever. And I don't know, it's he's a figure who I haven't seen all of his work. I should see all of his work because I love the man so much. But I don't know, like from what I've seen, it's just he has this distinct style that's sort of captured like the 90s, the late 80s and 90s action genre. And I love it. Kind of what you were saying, Bryan. It's like it's practical. Like you could like see the effects on screen. They're all real. The glass, the paper, everything. Like, to me, that's him. And I think other filmmakers in the late 80s or 90s like tried to replicate that sort of sense of practical action cinema that McTiernan is perfect at. And you definitely see it in Last Action Hero, and I love him. I'll mention this later too. It breaks my heart that he went through a lot of shit. Going to prison. Now he's out of prison. And I was listening to the commentary with him for Sony released Last Action Hero on 4K like 2 years ago. They released a disc, surprisingly, because this movie has always been seen as like a big bomb, and because of the cult following, because there was like a petition or something signed that said, "Hey, this movie needs proper release, like on physical media." So they finally gave it a physical media release with a 4K disc, and John McTiernan does a commentary for the movie, about a few months before the disc came out. So it's modern day John McTiernan, and he sounds a little tired. I do feel bad for him. He looks back at the movie and thinks, "Oh, I could have done it better, guys." And I want him to be back. I want those rumors to be true that he'll make another movie because I love the man. One of the best action directors ever. So yeah, I'm a big McTiernan fan.
Yeah, I mean, I'll also say that, like, as I mentioned before, the earlier movies, that trilogy of Predator, Die Hard, The Hunt for Red October, I love that. That is an amazing run of movies. To where it's like, dude, do whatever you want. And then he did do Last Action Hero, which is such a fascinating movie that we'll talk about in detail. And then afterward, I mean, there's not a lot, sadly, because it's like after that, it's Die Hard with a Vengeance, which I agree, great. Easily the second best and only other good Die Hard sequel, I would argue. Yeah.
I agree.
And then the Thomas Crown Affair remake, which I've heard is great. 13th Warrior, which is such a weird movie. I don't know if any of you guys have seen. That's a fascinating movie with, like, I would argue, bigger production problems than this movie reported to have. For sure.
Yeah, that's what I've read about that movie, yeah, unfortunately.
Then the Rollerball remake, which I've heard is not great. And then the movie with Ashley Judd and Samuel L. Jackson, which I remember seeing in a theater. And I just thought was very boring. And I don't know if I could ever go back to it because I was a kid, basically, when that happened. But, yeah, it's been 20 years since he's made a movie. But, of course, I think, sadly, regardless of our thoughts about the movie, the impact of this movie definitely caused, I would argue, was, like, the beginning of that downfall for him. And I'd also even argue, like, with Schwarzenegger, with not just Predator, but, like, this is prime Schwarzenegger to me between, I would say, like, Predator through to this movie. I think, or even like True Lies, even like right after this, I would argue like that's the peak Schwarzenegger, that sort of 7 or so year run, and then after that we start getting like your Juniors or your Erasers or End of Days, and it's fascinating that this movie, which I think is very misunderstood, is admittedly like one of those great Hollywood quote unquote bombs that we like get, I don't know, 2 or 3 of those a week now in modern parlance.
It is such a... I mean, watching this movie today especially feels so interesting because it feels like so many movies are doing the meta commentary on, you know, whatever genre they're trying to do. You know, we see it a lot in superhero movies. We see it a lot in like in newer action movies. And yet it's so interesting to watch this movie and think that like this movie's doing all of that meta stuff, and it's doing a lot of like, you know, my Zoom background right now is the scene where they go to the video store and they see the Stallone Terminator 2 like standee, which is such a weird like, you know, joke to put in there, especially considering their whole kind of, you know, kind of rivalry going on in the 80s and 90s. And yeah, it's such a fascinating movie to watch today.
Like Thomas was saying, it's like there are plenty of bombs, you know, nowadays, and I was gonna say, you know, we get a Quantum Mania, which is a piece of shit. You know, sorry to say.
No, it is.
No, this is an anti Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantum Mania podcast.
Okay, thank you. But like the big, you know, swing and a miss that was, it's like this swing, like I appreciate, and I want to go back in time and kind of like, you know, be there at this moment when it premiered, when it was out, and like be a defender of it. That's how much I like the movie now. It's like I want to go back and say, no, you guys are all wrong. I'm gonna go see this like 5 times in theaters, which is
you
what
would be on I don't know, in like what 93, like a Usernet channel. So I know how great this is.
It's like, guys, I saw it again last night for the 6th time. Everybody else is wrong. The things it does, like the meta nature of it, I still think it works. I think it's still a good commentary on, you know, action films and our relation to film. And yeah, I think it works now. And I just it's one of those things where it's like I understand why people didn't get it. I do that on one hand, but on the other hand, I'm like, I can never trust. Half the time, I can't trust, you know, film going audience people, because hey, we just had Oppenheimer. I guess a few weeks, you know, ago when this comes out, but hey, people made the right choice there, picking, you know, 2 great movies to see. But sometimes they don't do that, and I think this is very worthy of an audience to go, you know, and go and say, hey, this is actually good. So I don't know, but hey, now time has, I think, you know, won out. So I think people now recognize this as an actual good movie.
Yeah, for sure. I think a big part of that is kind of what Bryan was referencing earlier, which is just like a lot of people do the meta thing now. Post like, you know, the 2010s, this just became even more of a thing with like big blockbusters. But I think the problem with meta now is it's like, you know, your Deadpools, where it's like, yeah, you're referencing this as like a movie, but like, are you gonna do anything fucking cool with that, man? Like, you're just like, that's such an infinite playground to like leave it. I think this is very closely tied to another one of my favorite movies of this era, especially big studio movies, Gremlins 2: The New Batch, which is a zanier movie, crazier madcap movie. But at the same time, this I think is, I have a few quibbles with the way you can see some of like the, you know, the rewrites and the production problems on display a bit in this. But I think largely it's just a fascinating experiment to do at this particular time, where like, I think my biggest trouble is, I guess, like, I love McTiernan's work in this, but like I could see a Paul Verhoeven version of this movie being like the 10 out of 10 best version necessarily. But McTiernan at least still adds like a fun sort of groundedness to it.
And he even says in the commentary, he does admit, you know, touching on the production problems he had. It's like, it was one of those things where the studio wanted this movie to be the biggest movie of all time. Mm-hmm. And right off the bat, that's trouble, right? Especially with this kind of movie that tries to be meta in, you know, saying, what is the action genre? Like, well, how ridiculous it is. And it's in the tone that I'm with you. It's like McTiernan is a great action director, but he admits himself on the commentary even. He's like, I should have maybe went harder on the comedy. I should have maybe, you know, made it a more like ironic tone or lessen the seriousness. I think that's what it's missing. It's not perfect. I still like it a lot, but yeah, the tone shifts and everything. I don't know. And then we see a few years later, like Scream does it perfectly with that genre, with like horror movies. I think that's what this movie was trying to aim for, and Wes Craven got it, a few years later.
Or even even like after that, I would say another big thing. I think the best people doing any kind of meta-contextual like humor in mainstream movies today is, Lord and Miller. I don't think you get a Lord and Miller without sort of this being sort of a guiding light, I think. And yeah, I think it's fascinating. But I'm curious, Bryan, do you have any of these problems, like tonally, or because I think you're the biggest maybe defender of the movie?
Yeah, I really love. I think this goes kind of toe to toe with kind of any of those classic, 80s, 90s action movies that it's kind of poking fun at. But I think like the problem I have with a lot of the sort of meta commentary of today is it's sort of like it's them pointing out like the plot of the movie is stupid or whatever. Like, we get this, but by doing that, I think the modern movies, not all of them, of course, but most of them kind of will just deflate any of the tension or any of the stakes that you have, and it's like, well, if the characters don't care about this, why do I care about this? And this is a movie that's kind of going like, hey, we all kind of know the sort of, all these action movies, they kind of have like a formula that they're following kind of, and we all kind of see that. And the movie is kind of going like, well, yeah, but who cares? It's a fun action movie, and these things are they're important. And I love the way that this movie treats, that sort of love of movies, even with something as silly as like a dumb action movie, but
Right.
We'll talk later about sort of the Seventh Seal references and stuff like that, which is, yeah.
But I mean, I'll agree with you, and I think another big reason why, at the same time, it's like saying, yeah, whatever, this movie, but I think a big credit to Arnold. I think this is genuinely one of his best performances because he plays all the action stuff that we love about Arnold. It's great. But then once, like, the real world transition happens, or, like, it's even right before that, it's the scene where they go to his, like, second apartment that he has, which I love. Just like, I have this rinky-dink apartment. It's like a double apartment. It's like, this isn't bad for, like, just having your house blown up. This is really good. But anyway, he is just like, what's going on with my life? Everything's fucking falling apart. I have no relationship with my daughter. I pay some pharmacist to call the fucking police station so I can make fun of her, and then I'm like, what the fuck am I doing though? This is such a waste of my fucking time. And I think that makes all the stuff later on when he comes to the New World, and it's just like one of my favorite bits of this movie is him talking to recent Academy Award winner Mercedes Rule, and just being like, I never talked to a woman before. I can't believe it. It's
nice.
Okay, don't get me wrong. I mean, like, it's not necessarily like I think the problems with the tone is like a major like negative for me, but I think, I wonder, like, because I know Shane Black came in and rewrote the script, and threw in the Shane Blackness. I could feel it, and if he was the director, I think it would have been a 5 out of 5. But for me right now, it's a 4.5 out of 5. I still think McTiernan does like amazing work in this. And to your point, Bryan, it's like when you were talking about the tone and how modern day movies don't take things as seriously as they should. I think I'm going to be calling out modern day movies in this episode. it turns out, but like something like Renfield, that I'm like, it could have been something better.
Yeah,
it could have been like a more straight horror versus like a comedy with. I like Awkwafina, don't get me wrong. But what bugs me about that movie, it's like there are those scenes where the characters literally go, oh, that just happened.
Yeah.
And I'm tired of it. I'm tired of it.
Yeah.
This movie has like none of that, really. It does have those like those winks and those like, you're in a movie. But nothing as like Awkwafina-esque as what happens in Renfield. Again, I like Awkwafina, don't get me wrong, but in that movie in particular, I wish the tone were a bit slanted more towards like straight horror than what it actually was. But yeah, and this movie does that sort of genre balance between comedy and action here like better than I think other movies do.
With the Renfield thing, I completely agree with you because even, or at least somewhat, because like I would want the fun, like it's a horror comedy movie about like, this guy becomes Renfield's sidekick. That sounds amazing in theory. But the problem is kind of like what Bryan said, and what Marcelo said as well, like that happened humor, but also it's one of these new comedies where like I want the return to the studio comedy, but so much of it now is just like, oh, we need to have like a shootout or a gunfight, and it looks like shit. And it's like, I don't expect a comedy to have be the best looking like filmmaking, but it takes some skill, and like McTiernan at least knows how to do that, which makes the action stuff funnier, honestly, to me.
And also on that point, like, yeah, those action shootouts in Renfield, terrible. But then on the other hand, what irritates me is like they have like amazing horror effects in Renfield.
Yes.
And it could have been something great. Like a man's face literally like melts off, like in The Fly 2. And I'm like, God, I want more of that. But anyway, enough of Renfield talk.
Yes.
Stop myself.
I will just say, like, kind of like, sort of as like, the prime example of sort of what I guess we're talking about a bit is the way that the movie handles like when they go to the sort of LAPD building that's like, I don't know, this has like all these action heroes, I guess, and like they're in the office, and then the like Danny DeVito cat detective cop or whatever shows up, and then the kid is like, there's a talking cat, and Arnold's like, yeah, and he's gonna come into work tomorrow. Like, it is that sort of thing. Like, yeah, who cares? We've already seen it. Let's just move on. Yeah.
Or even just the small little bits. Like, I love Frank McRae, who's a great character actor who plays the chief of police here.
Oh yes,
love him, seeing him in movies, and him doing that cliche that we're all aware of, just like, oh, I'm the chief who yells at the guy. It's like, I need your badge and your gun, but he just like commits to it in the best way possible to such a ridiculous degree. It's so fun. But at the same time, there's that bit where, like, Austin O'Brien, the kid, like, says, oh, but your whole relationship, because I know how you really feel. Because that whole elaborate story that he goes on, it's just like, how did he know that? You said you never tell anybody. Like, there's a weird relationship still going on in the middle of this dumb joke.
Yeah. And it, like, and all of that stuff sort of, but it builds up the characters, and it, you know, it builds up, like, the Jack Slater, like, character. It you know, he's a real character, even though he's a parody of the kind of stereotypical Arnie, like, hero.
Yeah, I mean, okay, going back to the movie world, I want to point this out because I just made this connection in my head as you guys were talking. But have you guys seen Action Jackson?
No.
I have not.
No. I saw it for the first time a few months ago, actually. It was always a blind spot for me. And to me, that feels like a Jack Slater movie. Like, they made a Jack Slater movie in 1988. Produced by the same producer, Joel Silver, of course, who did Die Hard.
And this is the Carl Weathers movie, right? From the 88?
Yes, the Carl Weathers movie. Yeah. But he's playing this action stereotype that, like, is cemented in the genre for you know, years after and years before. It's like the most outlandish 80s action movie you've ever seen. That's Action Jackson. It never winks to the camera, really. And Carl Weathers as Action Jackson is this Jack Slater character, and, like, the whole movie is committed. And it doesn't really play as a parody. It just plays it like this is an action movie you want. These are tropes that you want. It has everything that 80s action movies you think like are in one movie. And that to me, they nail that in this movie, in like Jack Slater's universe. And I think it plays so well because, like, and this goes to I want to point out that I think this is the best Schwarzenegger performance I've seen. I think, honestly, because I think he really commits to the role of Jack Slater, and he really commits to that persona in that movie world. And then, like, when he goes into the real world, like he plays it like, yeah, he's like realizing that there's a little back and forth. I forget in what scene it was, but he says, like, yeah, it's like it's funny, you guys, but, like, I just realized, like, I'm fake, like, nothing in my life is real. And I think he plays it pretty well. So in that sense, like, the Jack Slater world, I think, is, like, perfect to me. And I guess going to that point about, like, tone, I think that to me is not a problem. Like, I think everything that happens in that world is perfect. I think John McTiernan knows how to shoot, you know, a classic 80s action movie, because he's shot an 80s, at least a few 80s action movies. So yeah, in that on that side of things, I think this movie's perfect in that way. Like, it captures that quintessential 80s action movie. And in terms of tone, yeah, you can't beat that.
Yeah, I mean, I would generally agree. I think here's my thing with it. I agree, and I think that's what really works about the movie world of Jack Slater. Has like so many of his hallmarks, down to the shot where Arnold, after the big funeral happens, and he like has the body of the gangster hanging. The fall is literally the Alan Rickman Die Hard fall. It's like nearly
that's right.
shot for shot similar, but at the same time, that makes it just funnier when like this is all about a farting gangster. And he goes into the Brea tar pits and comes out and just does. He literally has just like cartoon like swiping of his eyes, just like, oh, I can't believe that happened.
Yeah, what is like? He's silent but deadly.
Silent but deadly, right? Yes, it works because he has that sincerity, which I think is the big thing I love about Arnold in general. It's just like the sincerity is, I think, what separates him from Stallone has that, but more of in a genuine, dramatic way. Or even like Jean-Claude Van Damme is more in the camp of an action Jackson. Like most of his movies feel like Lionheart is pretty much another one, just like a lower budget. But he has the sincerity about like what's going on. So then when we get to the real world, it's benefited by his performance. I agree, Marcelo, but also just the way even McTiernan shoots most of that stuff looks so like grimy and like New York of like that particular like that weird transition point between like 80s New York and Giuliani New York that would happen. Like, it's the last days of, like, that particular filthy New York City. My only trouble, really, is just the sort of stuff that feels the most like a 90s kids movie with, like, I love Robert Prosky. He's one of my favorite character actors. He's fun in this movie. But sort of the magic, like, ticket of it all, like, there was a whole thing where the original writers for this were Zach Penn and Adam Leff were the original writers. And Zach Penn's, like, a big Hollywood screenwriter that, like, persisted pretty much to this day, where like a lot of the early superhero scripts were his, like Avengers and shit like that. Working in Hollywood for a while, and he had the issue particularly with the ticket, where it's just like, oh, this just feels like nothing. We didn't explain it in our version, which I could see an appeal to that, but at the same time, I do have at least a bit of sort of like a nostalgia for that particular time that benefits those sequences, which is nothing against Austin O'Brien, who we need to talk about as well, because he's our second lead, basically, of this movie. I'm curious how you all feel, because he was sort of the most controversial thing, I guess, in terms of, like, a lot of the reviews were sort of, like, hating on this fine kid actor, who was just, like, because he was in Pre-Hysteria, which I know, Brian, you have no idea what that is, do you?
No idea what that is.
This was a weird VHS, sort of, like, rainy day at school thing in, like, science class. Like, I don't know, you're in third grade, it's May 2nd, fuck it, here's Pre-Hysteria. And it is such, like, it's him getting visited by a bunch of claymation dinosaurs, and he, like, goes into a world of claymation dinosaurs. It's weird.
I don't even know what this is, by the way.
It's a very obscure thing.
It's got a great poster where he's, like, posing with, like, these like little toy dinosaurs.
Yes, it's interesting. But, yeah, how do you feel about him in this movie, Brian?
I think he's really good. Because, like, I can see why a lot of people would have issues with, like, with him or with his performance, maybe because he is kind of the 90s, kid. Like, I feel like every kid from the 90s was just him.
Down to that haircut. That fucking haircut, the JTT haircut. It was so prominent this time.
Yeah. And so, like, and he has the most kind of, like, he's trying to, like, convince Jack Slater that he's in a movie the whole time. He's got that whole thing, and he, could get kind of grating, I think, but, like, I think he's really great, and I think him and Arnie have great chemistry together, and like I buy their sort of their kind of relationship, and their comedy's great between the two. Like just the jokes between them are really really funny. I think he's really good. I don't know if did he go on to act as an adult at all, or
I mean, he did a couple things from what I'm seeing here. Like he's in the Pre-Hysteria movies, of course, My Girl 2. He was in The Lawnmower Man and Lawnmower Man 2. And then, like a bunch of TV show appearances over the last, like, 2 decades or so. I don't know. But what about Marcelo? What do you think of him?
I think he does a good job. And this is coming from somebody who really... hate is a strong word, but hates most child actor performances in movies.
I agree.
Okay, maybe that's...
I know what you mean. I'm with you.
Yeah. But I'll just say... Let me clarify that, and leave this in the show. My hatred for child actor performances, but
canceled.
Something like
Pico canceled.
But something like The Goonies, I cannot stand.
Yeah,
I cannot stand
100%.
Shrieking kid actors in movies for the most part. Sometimes they're great. Sometimes they don't annoy me. Temple of Doom, Ke Kwan, wonderful. I love that movie. I love his performance in that movie. And Austin O'Brien, similar here. I got a big, and I'm sure you guys may also have gotten this, but by the end, and I think it's very clear where their inspiration comes from. By the end, I felt very Spielberg, E.T., the music and everything, right? And I think Austin O'Brien is like, I don't blame any of the problems I have with this movie. I don't blame it on him. Like, by the end, I feel for him. I feel that he's like when he's like taking Jack Slater to the theater and trying to get him into his world and like saying, he's come on, you gotta do this, you gotta live. I felt that, right? But other moments when he goes cross-eyed as the car goes into the air, cringe for me. But that's not his fault. Like everything else, I don't know. He does a good job of like conveying that emotion as a kid who just loves movies and loves this movie character. And yeah, like Jack Slater is his E.T. And I think that connection is good between O'Brien and Schwarzenegger. So yeah, I'm defender of this guy. I don't think negatively of his performance at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very clear from the movie, not just with like the sort of whimsical, like attempting to be Amblin tone, like on a surface level, but even just like with that kid's backstory. It's just like, oh hey, he lives in New York City, his mom has to work all the time, especially at night, and he's just like alone in his apartment or alone at the movie theaters with this fucking, the only guardian being this old man who sleeps in the projector booth. Like it's kind of like a sad existence for him. So then when he's
by the way, I can relate going to the movies alone at night. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, I get this kid. There's like an inner sadness that they don't like touch upon explicitly, but they just like show like the mugging scene at the beginning. I think is all you need really of like the super sad part of it, where it's just like, oh man, this kid nearly got fucking killed in his apartment. This is terrifying. And then from there, it's like, hey, guess what, kid? You know what you earned? Movie magic trip. That's what you earned. Go ahead and follow into the screen. And you know what? He earned it. He earned that little trip. Even if he does say, I agree with the cross-eyed thing, or even some of the lines, like, I think the comedy sidekick thing he does is so close to working. I just think, like, the delivery's a bit off. It's just, like, it's so close to working for me. That whole sequence, down to, like, the E.T. homage and, like, the weird stop-motion version of him.
Yeah.
And I just made this connection. It's like, it does feel Shane Black at times, like Last Boy Scout, like, kid and, lead actor. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And I do feel like that Shane Blackness in this movie. But yeah, Last Boy Scout does it, a bit better, in my opinion. And it is a better movie, so.
But at the same time, a much better version of, say, than, like, the Jacob Tremblay character in The Predator, which is, like, the bottom barrel of that.
God damn it.
So bad.
Speaking of Troubled Productions, that movie. Yeah. God. All right. Anyway.
I think also, like, with this movie, a big thing about it, like, we should get into sort of the movie world itself and all the very over-the-top versions of all these various different characters and our cast here. Besides, it's like, we gotta talk about our man. I think maybe the MVP of this movie, despite how great Arnold is in it. But you can't beat Charles Dance as Mr. Benedict.
Oh,
who is
man.
just, I think, such an amazing... And this is, like... I don't know. He'd been stuff in the 80s. Like, he was in one of the early, like, the Roger Moore Bonds. I think it's For Your Eyes Only. He has, like, a small part in.
Yes. Is he?
He was sort of like yes. He's, like, one of many henchmen that's sort of positive. One of, like, the secondary guys. But still has a prominent enough role. And I think that's the thing, is that's what he was doing a lot, especially in, like, English productions throughout the 80s. And then this feels like such an early glimpse at, like, such potential for, like, so many great, like, genre performances that he did do, obviously, into, like, the 90s, 2000s, Game of Thrones, but also, like, I wish he was doing more of these than, like, how he appears in, like, every fucking upper low-budget horror movie that pops up, like, your Underworlds and some of your other ones, like, I, Frankenstein, I think, is the nadir of all that, but he's amazing in this movie. I think, Marcelo, you would agree?
I agree completely. I love Charles Dance. I've barely seen any of Game of Thrones. I just know him as the guy from Alien 3. That's my one go-to for Charles Dance. And also, he's great in Mank. I think he should have got...
He's really great in Mank.
He should have got more acclaim for Mank. But yeah, God, he's amazing in this. And McTiernan says in the commentary too, like he lights up when Charles Dance like does his thing in the movie, rightfully so, because god damn, he's just eating up. He understands what the movie is. He gets it. He knows what kind of villain he's playing, and it's again like those tropes that they get completely right in the Jack Slater world, like a villain who has a thing, and his thing is that glass eye.
Yes.
And Charles Dance's performance, like with that glass eye, I can't describe it. It works. Like visually, like he understands his character. He understands what he is, the movie, everything. So yeah, perfect Charles Dance performance in this. Perfect all-timer like villain, action genre villain performance too. Yeah.
Especially because I think the most clever stuff I think with the movie world kind of involves him in terms of his whole idea of just like, oh god, I'm a second banana henchman to like this fucking guy, Anthony Quinn, who's great in this movie. Very much making fun of Sicilian people, but we're good. He's good with it. He does it well. I'm not gonna.
You let it go, yeah.
It's not too long after the movie Mobsters. I don't know if there's anyone who's seen this movie, but with like Christian Slater and all them, he plays like literally a mob boss who's like, "Hey, I'm eating spaghetti over here." It's like so ridiculous, but whatever. I'm good with it. And I think he like the fact that Charles Dance has to like be the second banana to this guy, and he's like, "I fucking hate this existence. This is so dumb. I want to get the fuck out of here." And he gets his chance, and he becomes a weirdly intimidating force, despite like admittingly the fun stuff like when he finds that like weird greaser monkey guy who's just like, "Yeah, I'll help you out. What's up?" And then he shoots him, just like, "I shot a man, and I want to confess." And there's just like a guy's like, "Shut up over there."
It also just helps that Charles Dance, like, he just looks kind of evil a bit. Like, he's got that sort of evil Englishman kind of thing going on. And, like, yeah, Marcel, like you said, like, it's sort of that thing of, like, villain, glass eye. That's all you need. Like, it's sort of, it's almost perfect. But, like, I also just love that he is sort of, like, the lackey for this Italian mobster who also just, like, he doesn't get any of, like, the sort of, like, sayings, right? Or, like, just... Like, what's one of the ones that he says?
Oh, there's one where it's just like, "I'm sorry, I feel like a fourth wheel." And it's like, it's a fifth wheel.
Yeah. Yeah. I also just love the sort of, like, almost red herring of, like, you think that what's his name, like, Vivaldi, you think he's going to be the sort of villain, and then it's sort of actually Charles Dance. He reveals, and the sort of third act outside the world, which is, we'll get to that, but, yeah, Charles Dance rules. It's funny because I actually, like, I probably, like, knew of Charles Dance because of Game of Thrones. Like, I saw him and I was like, who is this fucking guy? And then, like, yeah, seeing him in other movies is great. And yeah, I agree with you, Thomas. Like, just because he was in, like, the Godzilla, like the bad Godzilla movie, the new one.
King of the Monsters.
King of the Monsters.
Yeah, that one's bad. But he's great. And it is interesting that he does Last Action Hero like a year after Alien 3. And if I remember correctly, in Alien 3, isn't he like the sort of sympathetic figure in that sort of...
Yeah, to me, it's a great moment in the movie where it's like right after I think his character and Ridley have sex.
Right.
And he's like, yeah, basically saying, I'm going to be here this entire time, don't worry. And then the alien eats him.
Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah.
That's a perfect moment in Alien 3. But yeah, he's great in that. And I... Just to touch on that and Mank, like I love that Fincher worked with Charles Dance in Alien 3 and then years later gave him like a great supporting character role in Mank. Like I love that.
That's interesting. And,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, of course, he's one of many great figures who pop up here. At least great actors who pop up in here. Some of these people are awful, but one person in particular. But another one of my favorite character actors who pops up in here, Tom Noonan as the Ripper.
Oh yeah,
hell yeah.
Who is just one of my favorites. Where like that's a guy who he did a lot of these kind of roles. Like he was the villain in RoboCop 2 not too long before this. Like this was kind of during a bit where he was going into mainstream acting, but he's such a fascinating, weird actor. Like I think one of my favorite performances of his is definitely say in not too long before this Monster Squad. Speaking of Shane Black. He's one of my favorite Frankensteins, I would say. That's also, for your Goonies comment earlier, Marcelo, I think that's the way better version of the Goonies. Fuck Goonies, I got Monster Squad, that's the way better version of it. And I agree. And his Frankenstein is so, like, tragic and sympathetic and wonderful. But at the same time, I love seeing interviews with him from, like, that movie, or even around this time, where he's just like 100% method actor guy talking about like, yeah, I'm Frankenstein in the Frankenstein makeup. Like, he treats all his roles seriously. Even this one, where he's playing just like a weird combination of like a slasher villain and an 80s action hero villain that like so works. And even like when he pops up also as himself, it's just like, what? I'm here. And like, that's just it. Get from... but yeah, amazing. I love the design of his character with like the makeup, and also that prop of the axe. Like, just genuinely works as like one of my favorite sort of like iconic props for like a villain character to have. And his raincoat and all that other bullshit. It's so fun.
Yeah, he is such a like he looks so like even if you see him like normal, you're kind of like, oh, who is this guy? He looks so like unique and interesting, and like, yeah, and he's so like, he does so many weird performances where he'll do like, he's in like the 2 like Charlie Kaufman films, like Anomalisa and Synecdoche, New York, and like, you know, in like The House of the Devil, like, you know, showing up there as like as literally. Yeah, he's such a weird actor. My favorite performance of his, as much as I do love him in both Charlie Kaufman films, I love him as Dollarhide in Manhunter.
Oh yes,
that movie is incredible. I love that movie. He rules. Yeah, I love him.
Yeah, I was going to bring up Manhunter because my favorite Tom Noonan performance is him as Francis Dollarhide too. But I also have to shout out like he was in Heat. You know, he's always this character actor who, you know, because like he's just so distinctive in like how unusual he looks, and I love him. Don't get me wrong, but yeah, I think this is why he gets roles like this, because he just looks like, you know, something like, you know, it's like he looks like a villain. He looks like creepy, but from every interview I've seen, like, and like even like him playing himself in this movie, he just seems like a sweet guy. So I love that. Like he embraces his look. So pitch perfect character actor. I love him, and I love him in this. And in the moments he's in, you know, briefly in this movie, he is like he kills Jack Slater's kid, which is insane. And it apparently was a note that the studio gave McTiernan, or I think like the ratings board or something gave McTiernan. It's like, hey, cut down on the child deaths here. And it's like, oh, McTiernan's like, oh, it's in the script. Oh, well, I'm going to shoot it. But yeah, great villain, Tom Noonan.
Yeah, and I think it's also fun given he's like famously not just the way like his physical look, but also he's 6'5". The man's giant.
Yeah.
He's such a huge person, especially like the only time you're allowed to really see is when he plays himself, because usually when they're doing like the movie, I think this is almost kind of a conscious thing, which works too, is that like Arnold was also like, what? How tall is Arnold? He's like 6 foot at least, right? But like he's but in this movie he feels like he's like 7.5. Like every shot makes him look so giant. To a way that I think really works for him.
According to Google, he is 6'2".
Okay,
so Schwarzenegger, wow,
right, shorter than Tom Noonan, which I think they try and avoid, which I think is just funny, and it fits like the kind of thing where it's just like, oh no, Jack Slater is not the same height as Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's taller for some reason. Which also we need to shout out, to go back to Schwarzenegger briefly. I think you do really see, speaking of sort of how timely this movie is, like Schwarzenegger as himself briefly when he's at the premiere is, I think, like the first genuinely funny sort of like Arnold being a parody of himself as he's kind of become at this point, which is like the Maria Shriver like, don't mention Planet Hollywood, and it's gonna be really tacky. And I love that shot too where like he's mentioning it, and that's the funny joke, but Maria's like in the background almost like she's puppeteering this like, good, yes, I want you to do this. Like, no, what the fuck? Anyway, let's get out of here. Arnold. He dips. And then even later on, like there's a bit of pathos even with that cameo when Jack Slater meets Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he's just like, you bring me nothing but pain. It's just like, that's what they would say. It's like one of your creators is like right next to you, just like, you bring me nothing but misery in my existence. Fuck off, Arnold. And then leaves.
God, that is a great moment. And apparently McTiernan snuck that in. According to him on the commentary, maybe it's something the studio didn't want in, but McTiernan's like, I gotta have this in, like that sort of breaking the fourth wall and like, yeah, poking at Schwarzenegger's like persona, and Schwarzenegger totally on board with, which, another reason why this movie's great. Like it's like you're saying, Tom, it's like he understands his persona, bringing up Planet Hollywood. Like, what other, Hollywood star would do that at this time? I mean, Tom Cruise, for as big of a movie star as he is now, I can't see him playing himself and sort of jabbing at his persona like Schwarzenegger did here. So.
I wonder why. What one particular element would you not want to see make fun of?
Certain things are in the closet, maybe. People are missing. Who knows? I don't know.
But, I agree, and I think while we're on this subject, I'm curious from everyone here, because a fun thing about this movie is the various cameos that happen. There are several. I'm curious, what's everyone's favorite cameo? Brian, what's your favorite cameo?
Man. I do like Robert Patrick showing up, just because I love seeing Robert Patrick. He's great. I love I mentioned earlier the Danny DeVito cat detective thing, because one, I think it's just so funny, and two, the minute you hear him, you're like, that is Danny DeVito. And he just shows up randomly, when he saves them from being handcuffed. And Arnie's like, you saved us. Oh, thank God you got here. And it's just so it's handled so casually, and just I love him. Yeah, he might be my favorite one.
That's a really funny gag, and also it works as kind of something that I feel like would have been a studio note at some point during the production of this movie. Kids love the Roger Rabbit. Recall to our last episode. Because we need some kind, I don't know, do a cartoon cat or whatever. And it's fine, we'll do that. But he's so weirdly superfluous in a funny way. Where he's just you would want, because obviously there's that great scene where they go to the police station, which I love also, one of my favorite Austin O'Brien lines. It's this is way better than the one I saw earlier in the movie. But then just it's the computerized version of Humphrey Bogart teamed up with a regular cop.
Oh, yeah.
Which is, and this is around the time of the Weird Robert Zemeckis Tales from the Crypt episode, which is one of my the most fascinating things. But yeah, that even also, it also feels like another studio thing. Let's do the early version. Gladly we don't have weird deep fakes of dead celebrities anymore. We avoided that, and now we're all great, right? We don't have any more of those.
Society is great right now, yeah.
Everything's great. Yep, everything's working perfectly.
What's your favorite cameo, Marcelo? What's your favorite?
Out of the many, I do love seeing Jean-Claude Van Damme in there, briefly. And I like the connection that he was in Predator playing the alien, and it didn't work out. There's that footage, infamously, of him in the Predator costume, and they're like, this isn't working. Goodbye, Jean-Claude Van Damme.
It's like a fucking lobster man just running.
But I like it that I like the fact that years later he's a big star too, and he was like, okay, fine, yeah, I'll be in McTiernan and Schwarzenegger's film and Water Under the Bridge. So I like that, and also shout out to Chevy Chase for being there for a split second, being pushed by Schwarzenegger.
Alongside Damon Wayans.
David Wayans is there too. Yeah.
In the same shot. That's all of their cameos, just to get bumped by Arnold.
Yeah. And it's one of those Chevy Chase, of course he's playing it up for the camera. It's whoa. Yeah. Half a second Chevy Chase performance that is funny. Yeah.
Maybe the last time he was funny in the 90s, one might argue.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Those are all great choices. I'm going to say I think my favorite is, you kind of quoted one earlier, Marcelo, with the Jim Belushi.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I like that one too, yeah.
It's very fun. But, if not those, I guess I even love just, the ones that don't make any sense to me. Art Carney's a weird one. That is but at the same time, his gag is funny, which is one, second cousin for Arnold, which of course, that's such a great parody. Just that's the wrong second cousin you messed with.
My favorite second cousin.
Right? But even his last line being just I'm out of here. And then he has the time mechanism is one of my favorite gags, and no one talks about it. Just where Arnold sees oh, it's addressed to me, and then it has the cards that say 5, 4, 3. It makes no sense.
I thought about this. I was wait, how does yeah, it makes no sense at all. And it's just that sort of action movie logic that the whole thing is running on. We've talked a little bit about Shane Black a bit here, but I want to talk a bit more about him, because I find he's so fascinating to me, because he wrote Lethal Weapon. Which ones did he write? He wrote 1 and two, or did he just write one?
He wrote one more specific. That was like, I mean, the history of Shane Black's amazing. Where like he wrote the original Lethal Weapon script while he was still like in college, and it got sold, and it was one of those like great success stories where it sold for like so much money, one of the biggest spec scripts ever. And he had this massive run in the late 80s, early 90s, even in Predator, the John McTiernan connection. But yeah, this is, I think, sort of the beginning of even his sad sort of downfall with like, because after this is like Cutthroat Island, right? Which I think he had like uncredited rewrites on, and some other ones that were just like really big flop, or even the Long Kiss Goodnight, which is a great movie. Love that movie, but massive bomb at the time. It's a shame, but I mean, what would you say is like your favorite Shane Black? Then what do you like really love out of him, Brian? I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, what I think is so interesting about him is that he's someone who clearly like he helped form the sort of action movie, you know, in some ways, of course, by writing like Lethal Weapon, which is such a huge, like, you know, was such a huge franchise and everything. And it's one of those things of like, you know, he helped kind of, you know, craft this style, and then but he's a guy who sort of knew what worked about it. He sort of knew why the formula worked and why these action movies worked the way that they did, and he's able to sort of, and still to this day, like able to sort of turn that into comedy, and yet he does a lot of that typical action movie stuff. He does it really well in, like, of course, his directed films, of course, like The Nice Guys, absolute masterpiece, I think. He's a fascinating figure in this whole discussion, I think.
Right. Even like the buddy cop thing is essentially just like, oh, we're pointing out like Lethal Weapon, two mismatched guys as cops. He kind of like, he wasn't the original person, but he made it so popular around this era. But yeah, what about you, Marcel? How do you think this fits in the Shane Black canon?
To Brian's point, I think it's interesting that they brought him in to basically rewrite the script that was a parody of the action genre, right? And it does come in a weird time in his career, because like I'm looking at it now, like it's right before Long Kiss Goodnight, and then he like, takes a break for several years, and then does Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. So yeah, like at the tail end of his run there, and I my favorite of his, I think it's Last Boy Scout, because I think that is perfect in what he wants to tell in the story, and what we'll see later with like Nice Guys and Iron Man 3. And Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, he's sort of telling that sort of the same story over and over again, like any writer or director does, right? But yeah, I think he does it perfectly in The Last Boy Scout. And here, like 2 years after doing The Last Boy Scout, writing The Last Boy Scout, like I mentioned earlier, like there's hints of, you know, his motifs in here with like the kid and like the, you know, the action hero, you know, lead. And I think for the most part it works. I feel the Shane Blackness of it all in this movie, and I do kind of, it's not that I'd prefer a Shane Black directed version of this, but I just wonder what that would look like, if it'd be any better. I think it would be better, but maybe not the Shane Black of, you know, 1993, the Shane Black of like 2003 maybe would have made this a better movie.
Yeah, especially considering he was like about a decade off from directing his first movie. Exactly. I don't know if he would be able to handle like all that pressure. I agree with that. I think a lot of like what I can see from the Shane Blackism is a lot of like the small details, because that's what I love about a Shane Black sort of script, is that like it can be like funny and humorous, but like the weird like internal logic of this kind of silly universe that he helps create with just small stuff like the fact that Austin O'Brien like only really tries to explain to Arnold in the movie world that like, hey, look, this is a movie and everything, whenever he like encounters like Brigitte Wilson, who's great in this movie as his daughter, or like the Chief, or even like initially Charles Dance, he doesn't play into the like, this is a movie, what are you talking about thing, because he's like, I'm just gonna accept the internal logic because I already have to deal with Arnold and I don't want to explain this to you, so I'll play along with the dumb plot that we're dealing with and then move on. There's stuff like that, or even just like the fun gags that feel like Shane Black things, like just that also makes it work for like a big bloated studio budget movie of like, oh, hey, Arnold and the kid are constantly driving while horrible accidents happen in the background of this movie. Like right off the bat with like the big chase sequence where like he's the kid goes inside the car and they're chasing and being chased by a bunch of great 80s 90s era henchmen like Sven Olthersen, or my favorite Al Leong, who's one of the great guys in like a bunch of John Carpenter movies, gets killed by an ice cream cone to the head, which is such a fun death.
Iced that guy.
Yes, exactly. But then like Arnold and him like jump off the highway and are like near a shipping yard where they land just in time. And it's perfect. And while they're driving away, he's like, "Look, I don't know, like why'd you get in my car?" There's just like a car explosion going on in the background, just like a massive car explosion. Or later on when they're just driving, Arnold's explaining the plot on the freeway about just like we gotta go over to the what's the gangster's name, like Joey the Fart or whatever the fuck.
Yeah.
But like while that's going on, like in the background, just cars are swerving around because like they're clearly driving center of frame, which is such a funny like filmmaking joke. That's like, oh, they're in the middle of the road where everyone's like, oh fuck, I can't change lanes. This guy's driving in the middle. It's that's the small stuff I think feels the most Shane Blackish, I would say, in here.
Yeah, one of my favorite jokes also that I just remember kind of in a similar vein is like at that sort of police station scene that the logic from the police chief is, oh, well, this kid already knows a bunch of stuff, so he should be your partner. And it's like, wait, what? Yeah. He's like 8. he's a child, but it makes sense with this, the sort of Shane Black logic of it all, which is, it's really great.
Yeah, like in a Shane Black movie, that's how it would go.
Yes.
It's like, this kid is her partner now. But in reality, nobody does that.
Well, I want to pivot a bit to something I just thought of, which is the sort of sequence, which I haven't really talked about, where he goes to school very briefly, and the like teacher has the whole like she's talking about like Hamlet and talking about how like riveting it is, and it's like Shakespeare has never been so riveting, and they show like the Laurence Olivier film and have this sort of that parody as well with like Arnie being like to be or not to be, and I love that sequence so much because it is sort of this thing of, you know, action movies are seen as kind of, you know, low art, and you know they're trash. And, you know, Shakespeare, of course, it's high art, it's sophisticated, and I love the sort of connection of like action movie to Shakespeare and sort of how, you know, that sort of weird relationship. But I also love how he becomes invested while watching like that movie. It almost reminds me of like when you get shown like a movie in like a history class and you're kind of bored by it, but you get really invested by the end of it or something. You know, it's a great scene.
That's the bit that feels the most sort of like what they're pulling off whenever they try and do sort of the Amblin tone. That feels like an Animaniacs gag, in theory. And it could be about silly, but it's like if an Animaniacs gag was animated so beautifully. Like, I love the way that sequence is shot. It feels almost like a film version of like what Sin City would do digitally, like about 10 years later.
Yeah.
It like looks, it feels like almost they're trying to kind of recall a sense, like this is I think the genius of McTiernan, sort of trying to make it like we're gonna make this look like this is the Seventh Seal, which we're gonna reference later. We're gonna like try and emulate that look, but have Arnold do dumb shit, which is so funny. They just to be or not to be, not to be. When it looks like that gorgeous, it's so much funnier in a way that like recalls the fact that around this time Arnold is working with, to some extent, like interesting auteur filmmakers like McTiernan or Verhoeven or James Cameron. People who like put all their commitment into like a movie this like ridiculous and over the top and like make it, you know, work while also admitting like we're here for Arnie. We're gonna have Arnie shit. He's fun, right? We all love Arnie, but we're also gonna make this look so fucking great at the same time. And I think that really goes missing after here, because with Arnold after this, like there's True Lies obviously, which has a lot of the Cameron sort of touches, but like a lot of his stuff after this becomes made by, you know, like solid journeyman directors, like Chuck Russell does Eraser, Roger Spottiswoode does The Sixth Day and stuff like that. Just like they're like made by like fine directors, but he like I miss him working with an interesting auteur, which is why I've been campaigning for this for years. I want this to happen. James, if you're listening in your submarine, I want him in a fucking Avatar sequel. Do it.
Oh my god,
I want
yes.
fucking like him basically playing like Conan Navi. That's what I want. That's my pitch. I want that in like Avatar 5, The Search for Awa, or whatever it's called.
One thing I liked more, or one thing I connected with more when watching this and that sequence when the kid is imagining Schwarzenegger and Hamlet, like it's like what you just did, Thomas. Like I want Schwarzenegger in an Avatar movie, right? I want Schwarzenegger in a Hamlet movie. That imagination, which I think they do it there, but it kind of goes away. That sort of like kid's imagination, like, oh, my favorite action star is in this story, right? I love that bit. I wanted a little bit more of that, I guess, in the movie. Sort of like this like whimsy that this child has. I mean, he says it, you know, he says like, I love this action movie, I love this character, but like seeing his thought process, seeing like his creativity, I love seeing that sequence. So yeah, I do like that sequence now. I think after seeing it, I think maybe the first few times I saw this movie, I'm like, why is this sequence in here? But I understand it now, you know, especially by the end when you totally feel like, oh, this is this kid's story. This is like a Spielberg-esque sort of like kid connecting with this character and seeing him as like a father figure. It's like that father figure is missing in this kid's life, so why not let it be Jack Slater? So that all kind of connected for me this viewing. So I appreciated that. So yeah.
Yeah, and shout out, by the way, we're on that sequence to another great cameo that's a bit more like of a deep cut, where that's Joe Plowright plays the teacher, who's a great British actress at this time, and was Laurence Olivier's third wife and widow. So it's her introducing Olivier to these kids, and you're like, you might have known him from Clash of the Titans.
The moaning Clash of the Titans.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess before we need to start talking about some other, like, I want to go to the real world at some point and talk a bit more about in detail about that stuff. But is there anything else from like the movie world that we want to bring up? Just any detail, small bit? I'll just say shout out another great cameo, Tina Turner as the LA mayor.
Oh yes,
which is amazing. Like right at the start of the movie, even that start of the movie is great. Like that feels like a perfect encapsulation of that era of action movie. Down to like the jokes, just like tell me, here's the lieutenant governor. Tell me when the governor's here, or the bit where he kicks the guy in the balls, which is like, you want to be a farmer? He has a couple acres, which is such a great dumb parody of just like, this was a line that feels rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. Like, fine, let's put it in here, but in like a really genuinely funny way. We're just like, sure, we'll go with this. This is like the 53rd option we thought of, but fine.
I feel like all these movies around this kind of era of Arnie's career are doing the sort of big introduction of like the first time you see him, it's like huge. It's like the biggest thing in the world. And yeah, his introduction is like him like walking on top of like the cars, just like him crushing like the radio like it was like just like sand. It just like crushes in his hand.
Yes.
Yeah, it's really great.
The McTiernan action, especially in the in the Jack Slater world, like perfect. Like that shootout in the apartment, it's like brilliantly choreographed, brilliantly shot, so many great gags. Like when Schwarzenegger electrifies the dead guy and like the dead guy's arm shoots another henchman. It's like those little bits, perfect, and like perfect in the action genre. And like I would see a Jack Slater movie directed by John McTiernan. It's like he nails it. But that's basically it. Because I don't know. Like I'll say one idea I had just off the top of my head. It's like maybe a different version of this movie would have been McTiernan just shoots the Jack Slater portions of the movie, and then another director shoots like the real world portions of the movie, whoever that might be. It's like that may have been one way to handle this movie, because I think McTiernan is a perfect action director. But again, as we transition into the real world, he may not be the perfect director to handle like the real world aspect of this movie, in my opinion, even though I think this movie's still great.
But while we were just on that sequence you're referring to, we should talk a bit more, I guess, about Brigitte Wilson with her amazing gag.
Oh, yes.
That she's just like, she like screams a lot, but it's like she just kicks ass royally and just destroys all these henchmen in like a complete subversion of like that type of character. But then I love even in the universe, though, Arnold is still just like, it's just going to grow up to be an old maid. No one will watch. She spent her prom cleaning her AK-47. And stuff like that.
She's great, by the way. And again, another actor in this movie who's committed, who knows the role, who knows like the character she's playing. God, she's great in this. Yeah.
I love later on when she just shows up with like the truck out of nowhere. Yeah, she's great. She's really great in this movie.
And one other great thing I want to say about this movie is all this. I think the production design is immaculate in terms of like when we're in the movie world, all the sets and even like big buildings feel so movie-like. Like even that gangster who's having the funeral on top of like a massive skyscraper that has like a big red roof and there's a pool and that's a fountain pool thing and all this other stuff. It's like it looks so opulent and crazy in the way that like these movies do, which also I think is my favorite sort of Arnold Austin O'Brien bit in this movie is when they're looking around for like, because he's just like, oh, you know where everything is? Well, where's like all this stuff happening? Where's the villain live? And he's like, on one of those big palatial estates with like a water like view. I don't know. It's one of these. I think there's like a bunch of these fucking places in this version of LA. And then when Arnold finds it, and the joke that he gives is just like, oh my god, I can't believe it. You revolutionized police detecting. All the time I was training about the human psyche and all this other stuff, and you just did it immediately. Congrats to you. It's like such a funny, I think the best comedic bit Arnold does here, or maybe in any of his comedies, because that's something we also haven't talked about. It's just like, this is coming off of like the Arnold comedy train with like your Kindergarten Cops or your Twins. Obviously, Twins is like the first big one. He's like at this point known for like all the comedies. And, at least this isn't, like, the true end of it. The true end of that is Junior, which is one of the genuinely like, worst career decisions. A way worse one than Last Action Hero by a country mile. But yeah, I mean, let's go into, I guess, the real world now, where, I guess, a bit more, Marcelo, and what you kind of hinted at. Like, what do you think doesn't quite work about McTiernan's version of this real world? It's a bit more grounded and grimy.
And I will say it. McTiernan even says it in the commentary that like he had in mind a vision of what the real world looks like in Last Action Hero, and he just couldn't like do it because of the production woes of this, because the studio breathing down his neck and basically speeding through the shooting process of this whole thing. And he even says like the tone of it's not right for what he was imagining this movie would be, but I think he should give himself a bit more credit, because I think it does work. I think the real world stuff does work, but in my opinion, as soon as like they get out of Jack Slater world, things slow down. I'm not like as invested as I was before. I know like one version of the original script had them just stay in the Jack Slater world and not leave. I don't know if that would have been better or worse, but like I could feel the production woes on screen as we came back into the real world, and maybe like the thread is lost. Like Charles Dance's villain, like his motive sort of is kind of cobbled together. Like, oh yeah, he's going to movies. He's going to bring out Dracula, and he goes to these movies, but he doesn't bring out these characters right away. He brings out one character, brings out Tom Noonan's character. But yeah, there's certain things like that. I'm like, it doesn't all gel for me as well as I think it should. I love this movie. Again, don't get me wrong, but I think it just doesn't come together as well by the end until they get to the premiere. I think by the time they get to the premiere, it does coalesce and it does work for me by the end. But there's that moment, there's these moments when they're in the real world, right when they get into the real world, and then leading up to the premiere where it's just not there for me. So yeah, that's my problem with the movie. It's like that middle of it just doesn't grab me as much as like the rest of the movie does.
Yeah. I can see that, but Bryan, what about you? Your retort to this, Bryan? I mean,
I was gonna say I agree with you in the sense that like something changes. I think when they leave the Jack Slater world, and it, like although I love the movie as a whole, I think everything from there up until the premiere basically is it's not bad by any means, but it is like. The movie's kind of stumbling to get there, It doesn't right. Really. You can see like Thomas, you mentioned earlier. I believe like you can see the rewrites. You can see and like Marcelo said, like the production problems and everything. But yeah, it's not bad. But it is that this part kind of is like it feels a bit like okay, what now? Kind of like what do we do now? And it figures it out. And I think that the movie comes to a very satisfying and like very thrilling conclusion, but yeah, getting to there is a bit rough.
Yeah, I think I will say this much. I think it works the best in most of like the lead up to him going into the other world. Stuff like Mercedes Rule, who's established as just like a solid like, oh what, I'm a working mom, single mom in the middle of New York City. I gotta like make this work. Like that's like it's enough shorthand that feels also very Shane Blacky. which is like I have to lie to a school principal for this and stuff like that. Always like a fun presence. Love Mercedes' role. I think you can see it the most in the Robert Prosky character, where I love Robert Prosky. Like, obviously, like Thief, Christine, such a great sort of like character actor who like you would see like with a cigar at any moment in a lot of these 80s movies. Like, such a fun kind of like sleazeball guy. And here at the beginning, he has a bit of that sleaziness, but he's still charming with the kid. Like, when Austin O'Brien goes up just like, hey, it's out of focus, you gotta make this work, and he's like, oh, what? Oh, God, I never do this, I'm sorry. Like, that works for, like, he's still sweet, but at the same time, it's like, oh, and the theater looks so run down and everything, and I think that's great production design, where they found, like, this amazing, like, I don't know if it's an actual set or it's a real, like, movie palace kind of theater that does not exist, basically, anymore. But it's a great set, and the way that it looks run down is just run down enough to where it looks like it would be a realistic rundown theater of this time that would have closed in the near future of like the 93 of this movie. Though that's also a weird thing where later on, after he becomes the magic guy, and like that's the most like really the bit where he's like, oh, my father ran this theater and Harry Houdini performed here. Anyway, magic ticket, and then it's like so quick. It's like the next line is magic ticket, And then later on, when like they're in the projection booth, and it has like that great moment Marcelo was talking about earlier about just like, I just found out everything's fake, whatever. But then Prosky introduces like, yeah, and they're gonna shut the theater down and packing up. Like, wait, this wasn't quite established before, really. Like, yeah. You just had us scene where he's like, no one wants to go to the movies anymore, or something like that.
One thing I noticed on the rewatch was like, yeah, the theater's shutting down, but they're gonna build a multiplex in there.
Yeah.
And like, wait, what? Yeah. And it's like you see it like signs for it as the kid, Austin O'Brien, walks out of the theater. It's like, coming soon, like a 10-screen multiplex. I'm like, well, I guess the movies aren't that dead. I mean, it's. I guess they should have like, dug into that a bit more. It's like this beautiful theater, like this, one screen giant, I was gonna say on film, but back then there was no film versus digital thing. But nowadays it would be like, we're gonna tear down this like one screen theater and make it like a 10-screen like digital, multiplex. But
right,
but the movie, I hate saying this, but like, yeah, it's like you're gonna tear down this one theater, but you're gonna have like 10 screens though. The magic of movies are still gonna be around, but just smaller screens.
There's a version of this movie where you just introduce, like, the guy who's running that cinema. If you establish, like, the theater we see later, I think is the one that he's running the, like, preview screening for the premiere. I think all it's missing, really, is a scene of, like, that guy delivering the print and being like, oh, this is filthy. And it's just like, whatever. Look, we're, like, someone who doesn't have the investment in, like, the movies, like Prosky does, he's just like, whatever, we're gonna make profits. We're gonna, like, make this a massive theater where, like, oh, yeah, the popcorn stand's gonna be, like, half of it or something. Like, make some kind of joke about that, like the movie that basically like he's the guy who like basically is in cahoots with the studio executives at Sony who were making this movie, of just like, yeah, we'll tear down that old theater, whatever, and then we'll premiere it at a big multiplex where we don't really care about like projection or don't have any interest in it or something like that. There's a way this would have worked, and it's just not there, really. It's a real missing, as it were.
I mean, don't get me wrong, I do love there's one theater here in Austin that does look like this theater that they show in Last Action Hero, and it's just as beautiful, just as like, glorious, with a balcony and everything. And it does, if they were to make this now, they would definitely like, dig into like the film versus digital thing,
right? And
I would care a lot more about that story than this story back when everything was on film. Like, I don't want to take that away. I don't want to say, hey, let's turn on this one screen, it'll be fine. But I think to your point, Thomas, like, they should have dug more into just how important this one theater is, how important this one screen is, and how you'll be losing, the majesty, the historical aspect of like this theater if it goes away, and they kind of miss the point of that whole thing by the end, I feel.
To firmly date myself as well, if this is the only time I may ever reference a Disney Channel original movie doing a slightly better job of this, there's The Phantom of the Megaplex, which is a movie that Disney Channel put out that's about like, oh, we're working at like a multiplex in like the late 90s, but Mickey Rooney has this weird role as like the guy who used to be at the theater when it was a one-screen palace, And they just so like let him come, and he's like, "Oh, the movies were so magical back in my day. They were so wonderful, and I miss the magic of these movies." As you know, the man's dead, but he looks so drunk in that movie. He looks legitimately like he is red-faced and just like so full of alcohol at that particular point. It's so funny in that movie. But Bryan, like, what are some? Do you agree with those concerns? Like, are there any others about like the real world stuff, more specifically?
I just think it is a thing of like the movie doesn't have enough time really to go into any of that stuff, because it is like at the same time it's dealing with kind of what we've set up in the Jack Slater world of the villain coming over, and Charles Dance trying to like bring these movie characters to kill Jack Slater, or to kill the real Arnold Schwarzenegger. And yeah, it just kind of, I think it's, it has to sort of set up all of that stuff in the third act, which does lead to like the premiere scene, which is so incredible and is so like, I mean, we mentioned like just the cameos of like everyone walking in and everything, and but just the sort of like actual scene where like Arnie, kind of tackles Arnie, and it's, that sort of moment. I love that stuff. It's a really great moment, and yeah, it's great. I don't know, but I do see your guys' points though.
But honestly, my favorite thing about that premiere sequence is even just like a story beat that like Jack Slater character gets hurt for the first time. Right. I think that's what's like, that adds a weird drama that I think worked a lot more on me this time than it had previously. Where it's like, oh, this guy who's so invincible, he gets shot and like Arnold looks bloody. Arnold looks like he's been like seriously injured, like the stuff in the ambulance with the weird Melvin Van Peebles cameo, which is the weirdest one because like he doesn't say anything and he's just there. Like Sweet Badass Song himself is just an ambulance guy. Okay, sure. But anyway, it still is like so like fascinating, that particular element where it makes the stakes of it actually real. It's the first time in the real world that you feel genuinely like, oh my god, is it going to actually make it? And is this actually going to work for him? It makes Tom Noonan a lot more like upsetting, or even just the bit before he even gets shot, where like Arnold grabs the kid as he's like hanging and just does like the little aside, but like, please don't let him fall, or like holds him and like lifts him up and he's like, my arm's out of my socket. Like there's a humor there, but it's also just in like the disbelief he almost has, where just like, oh my god, I feel so human now and it sucks. And I hate feeling human in this world.
I think that all works, and I think Schwarzenegger's performance really delivers that pretty damn well. It's like he's human now, and yeah, like you're saying, like when he gets shot, it looks like he like somebody actually got shot, and that ambulance sequence does feel real. It's like Schwarzenegger as Jake Slater, spewing blood is like the oxygen mask is on him, but yeah, it's intense, and I think it the reason why I like Austin O'Brien in this is because of those last few scenes where you believe that this kid really believes that he can save his hero, and they have to. The one aspect that kind of like, again, gives me pause, and I'm like, is this another like rewrite that just doesn't connect? It's like Austin O'Brien's character like pulling out the gun, and all the ambulance people like running out of the ambulance, and then now Austin O'Brien has to drive, to the theater. Kind of wonky there, but other than that, it feels I'm completely invested by that point. Forget any complaint I had before this moment. It's like I'm like, yes, get him to the theater. The magic of movies can save this guy's life, and if anything, like that will thrill me as an audience member. Like I love that stuff.
Yeah, and I think at the same time, what also works about that is like even when we get. Like, there is some of that wonkiness, I agree, considering, like, the gun thing is also... That was established as, like, a thing that can happen in the Jack Slater world. But then it also happens here. It's like, there's no weird... It was almost like an Abel Ferrara moment, where it's just like, oh my god, this kid has a gun. And shit's, like, very serious for a second. Maybe the guy who should have done what you're talking about, like directed the real-life stuff in the movie. Like that, or even, like, when he, like, hits the taxi cab, like, not too long after he gets in, it's just like, excuse me, I have an airbag. It all works out fine. Like, those small sides. But even, like, we mentioned Charles Dance has this whole scheme of, like, oh, I'm going to bring out all these different characters. And there's, like, a world where I wish that happened. But also, like, considering the world we live in, where, like, we've seen that now, and that doesn't nearly satisfy me, really, anymore. I mean, there's a world where, like, McTiernan does, like, a clever version where, like, Freddy Krueger or Dracula or whatever, I guess. If it was maybe even classic movie villains, that could probably work. But at the same time, I'm glad with, like, the only one we get is such a weird left field choice that
so
we kind of referenced, right,
Oh,
of
yes.
Ian
Yeah.
McKellen's
Yeah.
Seventh Seal, which is very interesting given this is very early Ian McKellen's sort of, like, American film stuff. Like, before this, he was, like, obviously on stage in England for so long, and then he would appear in shit like The Keep, the Michael Mann film The Keep, where it's just, like, that doesn't quite, like, use him that well. And this is, like, I think one of the first American productions to do it very well. This is the same year also, I believe, as his Richard III, which is an amazing movie. If you've not seen that, it's a great fucking wild, trippy Shakespeare adaptation. But I think, yeah, he works here as just like, oh, he's just coming, like, the way he pops out of the screen, that gives me such, like, MGM Studios, Universal Studios of this era vibes, of just like, it's coming right out at you in this, like, 3D sort of way. And then McKellen weirdly treats it, like, very, like, seriously, with just, like, the, oh no, you live to be a grandfather. Like, weird lines like that he treats with utmost seriousness of, like, you know, the Seventh Seal itself. It, like, works oddly, despite how odd that cameo is in theory.
What's the line he has where he's like, I don't do drama, or I don't do fiction.
Yes,
not my specialty, or something like that. Yeah, and it's weird because, like, McKellen doesn't really look like the actor who's playing Death in the Seventh Seal that much, but because he's fucking Ian McKellen, you buy it. Like, he just sells it immediately. Even
right from, like, the first shot we see him is, like, he's still in the Seventh Seal, and Max von Sydow's archive footage is behind him, but it's like, you know, it works.
It weirdly, does, yeah. Yeah, it is such a weird pull, too, for, like, this action movie to pull of, like, this old 60s art house, you know, movie from Sweden. Like, yeah, I'm not the type of person that, like, would have loved to see, like, all these, you know, villains come in from the movies into the real world. Like you said, Thomas, like, I mean, we, you know, see last week's episode on a Space Jam: A New Legacy, where we talked about it a little bit there, like, Christ. Yeah, but I think it works because it is such a, like, really? Like, they're gonna use the Seventh Seal? Yeah, and I will also say, like, what you guys were talking about earlier with, like, Jack Slater being, like, shot and the sort of real tension there, it does lead to probably my favorite joke in the entire movie, which is when they get back and just they're like, oh, we need a doctor, and then the doctor's just like, what the fuck is this? This is like a flesh wound. This is nothing. That was the one that really, really got me.
Yeah, which was like a fun, like, sort of reprise of, like, the sort of the finishing point, the callback of, like, the earlier doctor bit when he's at the funeral. And it's just like, is there a doctor here? It's like, I'm a doctor. Oh, check his chin. Like, someone please help him.
Look, an elephant.
Yeah, look at Which also leads into an amazing shootout in an elevator, which is an example of the great McTiernan action. That's like so over the top, bizarre, but, like, just works well enough. I might argue a better version of what is even done very well in True Lies the next year.
I agree.
You know, thank you for saying that, Thomas. Yeah, I feel that way too. I once again reminded of that connection to True Lies, or that similarity, you know, to True Lies after watching this sequence, like, earlier today. I'm like, oh, that's right, True Lies does this later, but I like this version better. Yeah, because it's McTiernan. For me, it flows better.
We love Cameron, not his highlight. Not his highlight. No.
Controversial take for me. I'm not a huge True Lies guy now. I rewatched that a few months ago.
Are you saying it doesn't hold up very well because of various things?
It does not hold up very well.
I will say, I was someone that was, like, my big sort of, you know, it's kind of the biggest movie from Cameron I hadn't seen for the longest time because it wasn't available, and, like, you know, and when it was finally put on, like, Hulu, I believe, like a year ago or so, I watched it and I was like, oh, Jesus Christ. Like, yeah, the stuff in that movie has not aged well, although it's
rough.
The parts that do work about that movie, though, are, like, the James Cameron action stuff. Like, that's, you know, but
the horse sequence is like a top tier Arnold sequence, no arguing about that. That's the highlight of that whole movie. But but I mean, we've been going for a bit. And I guess before we get out of the last section here, we need to talk about sort of what I referenced earlier at the start of this, the fallout of it. Because this movie came out June 18th, 1993. Key thing, a week prior, Jurassic Park came out. So, no, it was never going to be top dog like they wanted, really. And it made, it cost $85 million, made $137.3 million, which I think is like a key part to me where like this feels like one of the earliest examples of like, oh, everyone's kind of like the narrative against this movie going into it, where there's a bunch of stuff where like this was such an overly exploited movie to the degree that you had stuff like my Zoom background, which is the giant inflatable Arnold, which you see at the Jack Slater premiere, but was also on display at Cannes. So people had the same reaction to this almost like the Emoji Movie several decades later. I'm just like, oh, this is so everywhere, and they're just shoving this down my throat. It looks so bad. This is so dumb. And people kind of got scared away from it, and it was a big sort of blow to, like, McTiernan's career, but also even, like, this is the big thing where, like, Sony in the 80s, 90s is a fascinating tale of just, like, like the John Peters and Peter McGruber stuff. This isn't one of those, but it's, like, in the fallout of that with Sony, and it's just like, oh my god, maybe this will work. This is a Hail Mary pass, and it really wasn't for them, like, at all. And it was even a big thing. We mentioned Arnold sort of being aware of himself. This was his first big producer credit on any of his movies, which is kind of insane. But it, like, you can see, like, so much of that ambition on display where, like, he had control over, like, who got the directorial seat, like, the casting, the merchandising. He had the weird thing where, like, oh, all of the action figures for Last Action Hero don't have guns. Which is such a weird misread of, like, that's... I mean, I get you were want to, like, I guess, tone down violence, but it kind of really feels like the one of my favorite Arnold jokes in Last Action Hero as himself, which is like, we only killed 48 people in this movie, unlike 119 from last time. So, like, we're cutting down on it, and it just feels like you're fundamentally misreading the movie. We're just like, if you're gonna have the merchandising, have Arnold have, like, the biggest gun. You have the AC/DC song, Big Gun, which I love how dumb that song is. Like, the original song for this movie is just called Big Gun, and it's all about just, like, big movie screens and shit like that. Like, they were so invested in all this, and then it got so torn down that, like, famously, like, this apparently is in that documentary you mentioned earlier, Marcelo, that, like, the fallout of this really hurt Arnold's career to a degree, like, and he really took it hard, where this is in the documentary. He says, quote, "I cannot tell you how upset I was. It hurts you. It hurts your feelings. It's embarrassing. I didn't want to see anyone for a week." And even speaking of True Lies, James Cameron called him and said it was, quote, "That's the only time I've ever heard him feel so down about himself." Which says a lot, because, like, part of the charm of Arnold Schwarzenegger, the public persona, is how jovial and fun he usually is on, like, the red carpet, especially if you see, like, all the interviews he was doing around this time. Just like, oh, it's fun, jovial Schwarzenegger. And this just, like, I think really hurt him in a bummer way.
Yeah, which is kind of sad because the movie is great. It's a great action movie, and yeah, I did look at, like, this movie made $50 million total domestic in the US, which is, yeah, very rough. And yeah, it is very, it's weird, and it, it's one of those things of, like, how time changes and we can reassess these movies, and they change based on the culture that we're in, right? Like, this movie now is so fascinating, as especially with all the meta commentary we've been talking about. It's very interesting that he took this one real close.
Yeah, and the production and outcome of this reminds me of a movie I referenced earlier, Alien 3, where, yeah, that also went through, like, the studio basically pressuring David Fincher and the production just to rush through this movie, release it on a release date that was already set, and, the studio expecting Alien 3 to be, a huge hit, and it wasn't. And Fincher disowned it. Luckily, McTiernan doesn't disown this. Even though as much as he, like, laments decisions made, he does blame the studio, like, on the commentary too, which is good to hear. Studio pressures of, like I said earlier, they wanted to make this the biggest movie of all time.
To the degree that apparently they did the first ever advertisement on a space-going rocket for this movie. That's how ridiculous the publicity was for this. Just, like, in space, it's up there. Just, like, that's how seismic they wanted this to be. And once again, Jurassic Park comes out a week earlier, and it's like, nope, No, guys, no space rocket's gonna help you.
No. And to me, this is much like Alien 3. Like, to me, this is, you can definitely sense the McTiernan of it all. You can sense he put in as much as he could into this, and the great action, the character work, I think even works. Like, a lot of it works because he was putting in his all. And for Alien 3, I think Fincher tried to put as much of himself into it, and you can sense it. And I still think that movie works despite, it being a box office bomb, and most people think, well, not most people. Nowadays, I think people have come around to Alien 3, but yeah, to me, I think Alien 3 is great as I think Last Action Hero is. And this is all despite, 20th Century Fox on Alien 3 and now Sony Last Action Hero, like, just basically, tightening the screws on every aspect of production. But yeah, it's a miracle that we're talking about it 30 years later and we're saying positive things about it. So despite it being a box office bomb. So yeah, I'm grateful. Yeah, I'm grateful that Sony came around and released this 4K, disc, and basically admitting, like, yeah, it's a good movie.
Yeah, I need to get that 4K because I know for the longest time I didn't get it on home video because they had that really bad Blu-ray. Like, a friend of mine had the Blu-ray. It's a terrible, like, one of the worst Blu-rays for, like, a major release I've ever seen. That's so rough. I need to get that 4K. But you know what? While you're talking about that, I guess wrap that up into your final thoughts, Marcelo. Any final thoughts you got about Last Action Hero before we get to our next segment and everything?
One last thought I had. This ties into the Seventh Seal discussion. Like I said earlier, like, there's that, part of the movie where they get out into the real world and then they putz around until the premiere, and the promise of, like, Dracula, coming, into the real world, that, like, provoked a part of my brain. It's like, yeah, I want to see that, even though, it would have been a bad thing, I'm glad you guys brought up Space Jam: A New Legacy, because, like, yeah, it would have been on that side of things. I think ultimately that sort of promise or of, like, a character, coming into the real world, we see it happen with that Seventh Seal section, and, like, it's a great capper to that, like, concept, to this concept of, like, a movie characters coming into the real world. I know why we haven't brought this up, for the last 90 minutes, but I got to bring up Purple Rose of Cairo. I will never see that movie again for various reasons. I'm happy to have this movie replace it as the movie that, brings in movie characters from a movie world into the real world. I'd rather see this over and over and over and over and over again rather than Purple Rose of Cairo. I love this movie. I love that promise of, like, movie characters going into the real world, and you see that here. And yeah, I'm connected with Austin O'Brien as, like, a kid who loves movies and who meets his favorite movie character in person, and who has that love of movies by the end. And yeah, I know I can ramble on and on about this movie. I love it. I'm glad I got to talk about it here. So yeah, those are my last thoughts on Last Action Hero. Great action movie from the early 90s that I think if people haven't watched or haven't revisited it in a while should do so right away, because I think it does hold up.
Yeah, and I like to mention the Purple Rose of Cairo thing, where at the very least, like, this director went to prison for at least, like, what was that happened with McTiernan? Like, the thing is, the crime is, like, it's like a weird tax evasion thing, right? Where, like, it was tax evasion and then also the, like, wiretapping a producer's phone, right?
That was, I think, the main thing. He got caught wiretapping a producer's phone, and, in the state of, I think, California. A big offense. So yeah, that's right. The main reason why he was brought down. In terms of, criminal activities, I can forgive him. Tax evasion, sure. I think we all forgive Wesley Snipes for tax evasion, sure. And also wiretapping.
It's just weird. That's not even, like, offensive to me. It's just, like, that's bizarre that you went to prison for that.
It is bizarre, but, like, the good thing is he served his time.
Right.
Like, he did his time and now he's out. So that's the good thing. Like, at least he went to prison for it, and he did house arrest, I think, for the last year of his sentence. So he did his time, folks. So,
yeah. And also, like you kind of mentioned, way worse crimes committed by certain people in Hollywood that get away with it just fine. But anyway, Bryan, your final thoughts on Last Action Hero?
Yeah, this is, like I mentioned earlier, last year I did this whole like action movie extravaganza. I watched a bunch of old like classic, action movies from this time, and this was when I watched kind of towards the end of that, getting towards the end of this period, and it felt like such a great way to cap off that sort of that marathon, because it's a movie made by not just one of the best action directors of all time, but of this period especially, and it's someone who, of course McTiernan, but also Shane Black, who understood this genre so well and could actually craft incredible action sequences and have them look great, while also being aware enough of kind of the silliness of this genre and kind of, how, the silliness that you can see in these action movies, but commenting on that, but the stakes are there and everything, you feel the tension and all the action sequences are incredible. It's an incredible action movie that, actually comments on its genre in ways that I find clever, and where most of the time I find these things to be very annoying. It's great, and it's a great movie. I think, especially if people may be aware of, like, maybe haven't seen a lot of Arnold's films, I think this is an interesting one to kind of go into, because it's about his persona. So yeah, I love it. It's a great movie. It's one of my favorites of this period. But yeah, what about you, Thomas?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that you guys have been saying. It's not necessarily like I'm looking at my Arnold ranked on Letterboxd, and it's in the top 10 as an overall movie. But I would still say his performance, I would argue, is like top 3, with, I would say, or it's top 5 at least performance, because I love Total Recall. I think is my favorite Arnie performance. It feels the most kind of like the best of both worlds with him. But then the first 2 Terminators, and then Conan the Barbarian, which I think just often gets sort of swept away, because it's like, it was his earlier movie, but I love, that's such a great use of just Arnold as a sort of physique in this particular way. It's like so fascinating, a use of him. And then probably Last Action Hero, and then just for like the silliness, I think my favorite sort of silly performance, it feels like the closest to a Jack Slayer movie, Commando, is just amazing.
Yeah,
ridiculous bullshit. It's so great. Love it so much. But yeah, I think still, regardless, Last Action Hero, an amazing early attempt at this sort of meta thing that has been done much worse by some other people, but also in intriguing ways by certain people. Like I mentioned, if you like Chris Miller and Phil Lord stuff, I think you owe a lot of debt to this movie. Down to especially, I think, the line that we kind of referenced earlier, but I think that the meta bit that works so wonderfully, and I think really blew my mind when I was a kid, especially, because I saw this when I was a kid, and I was a bit weirded out by, like, I don't get what meta is, because I'm, like, 7 watching these other Arnold movies. But it really clicked with the Stallone Terminator 2 moment. That's like the blockbuster. As a kid, just fascinated me about, like, so who's the Stallone guy in that world? Who's, like, the guy who has the Stallone career of Rocky and all these other things? Just like that immediately, it sort of was like an early sort of awakening point of like, oh, this makes me think about like the career of an action star in particular and what they're commenting on, while at the same time doing dumb bits like the 555 joke, which is also in there, which is amazing. That's where we have area codes, stupid, and all that great stuff. But now it's time we get to our weekly segment, Between the Lines. So every episode, myself and Bryan and our guests in the future, someone's breaking ground here as having a particular movie choice, but we each bring to the table another film that in some way is either related to the movie we're talking about, or could be maybe a potential other option for Atypical for this miniseries. Bryan, go ahead and go first. What is your pick?
Yeah, so I only watched a couple of Arnie movies in preparation for this. I was initially going to watch all 3 of the Ivan Reitman comedies that he did. I didn't have time. I only watched the first 2. And I'm going to recommend Twins, because I hadn't seen Twins before. I'd only just been aware of, like, he's big, he's small. That's the whole movie. And watching the movie, it is basically that. Like, that's the whole joke. It's just he's a big guy, and then Danny DeVito's just a small guy who's loud-mouthed and, whatever. But even, like, I was thinking about it because Thomas, you and I talked about this a bit recently, where, like, it feels so much like a lot of studio comedies nowadays have to do the whole, like, there's gunfights and shootouts and stuff. Also, speaking of, like, Renfield, they have to have these big action sequences. And I'm really, like, sick of that. I think, studio comedies should just go back to being comedies. And it's interesting to watch a movie like Twins, which does that, and it's moderately successful. It's an okay attempt at it, but I do love the jokes between them, Arnie and Danny DeVito they're just funny. They're just so great, and seeing them, act off of each other is great. And I mentioned this to you, Thomas, but, like, one of the funniest last jokes in any movie with the chains, it just made me laugh for like 5 minutes straight. It was really, just a really great joke. And, and also just an interesting fact of, like, when I was looking it up, that, like, because Arnold doing a comedy was thought to be, oh my God, it's gonna bomb. Like, no one wants to see Arnold do a comedy. And DeVito, is it DeVito, Arnold, and is there someone else in that I'm missing? I can't remember. But
I mean, this Ivan Reitman directed it. I don't know if you were gonna refer to him or not, but
well, just the deal that all three of them, like, had, where they retained kind of they got profits from the films, like box office,
right,
for making just an interesting, and just how big the movie did for how kind of deceptively simple it is of just getting a big guy and a small guy. Twins.
I don't love Twins. I think Twins is definitely a movie where I feel so much more of the executive meddling kind of stuff in it. And just in terms of, like you mentioned, the kind of comparison to, like, the modern kind of, like, action comedy thing. But I think that's maybe less even a studio thing, more just like, Ivan Reitman's not a great action director. He never really was. The comedies with him and Arnold work. Like, I think the better one is Kindergarten Cop, which comes right after this, which I think is the better blend, where the action is just at the beginning. It's this weird, like, almost Sylvester Stallone Cobra style wild thing where he's got the trench coat on. It's like, this is so, like, weirdly seedy for this fucking basically kids movie that we're gonna get from here. But at the same time, Twins, I mean, that was definitely a movie I watched when I was younger. That was one of the ones, like, my dad loves Twins. Very much a, like, Sunday afternoon dad movie that he'll fall asleep about 10 minutes into, but he'll wake up for every joke that's funny. That's why he just only remembers that. It's not any of, like, the dumb, like, crime plot, but just stuff like that. I'm the fuzzy end of the lollipop from DeVito, or even Arnold. Like, that's where the earnestness, I think, is a great example of that with Arnold in that movie, where, like, his character's so, like, naive. It's one of the better fish out of water things, where he's just like, oh, look, I've been trained for years, but I'm gonna be styling in this outfit that matches Danny DeVito's. It's cute. And I think it makes, like, that relationship work despite all the problems around it, I would say. I don't know if you have any Twins thoughts, Marcelo.
It's been so long since I've seen Twins, honestly. That was, like, a staple when I was growing up, like, on cable, just watching Twins on TBS, but I cannot form an opinion on it now. It's so far removed from the last time I saw it, which may have been like 20 years ago. So I don't know. I'm due for a revisit, but I'm not expecting much, if I'm going to be honest. I remember Twins and Junior sort of being like those two touchstones of, like, oh, that's right, Dan DeVito, Schwarzenegger, they did movies together. Like, that was, like, the thing for a while. And then, and Junior, I have, like, even less of, like, a admiration for my memory. I think also as I probably haven't seen that in, like, 20 years, too. So, yeah. I'm far removed from those movies, so who knows if I'll see them again anytime soon.
It's much better than Junior. That is such an unfair. Twins is at least sometimes funny.
Okay, but I will say, though, Kindergarten Cop, that one I saw a lot more times as a kid. That was one movie that my sister would rewatch on VHS over and over and over again, and that is, like, in my head. like Kindergarten Cop is fully in my head. That may be one of my favorite Schwarzenegger performances, and that one I haven't seen in a while too. But that one is further buried in there, and I have good thoughts on Kindergarten Cop. I will say that, even as ridiculous as it seems, like your mention of like Schwarzenegger basically being like a Cobra-esque character. Yeah, that's in there. There's a ferret. Schwarzenegger plays like with these kids. It's not a tumor. All that is in my head. So favorable thoughts on Kindergarten Cop. I will say that.
I'm a cop, you idiot.
Detective John Kimball. Anyway.
Well, I'll go ahead and go next here. And my pick is one that's not really a blockbuster, but has a very similar kind of meta-narrative to it. That's very much echoes from Last Action Hero, but I think is also a criminally underrated movie. I saw this movie at South by Southwest one of the years I went. Oh. And this was like my favorite movie of the festival, honestly. I loved it so much and stuck with me, and I love introducing it to anybody who I think would kind of love it. It's the 2015 film The Final Girls, not to be confused with another film from that same year called Final Girl, which is very bad, a very forgettable, dumb horror movie. This one is a horror comedy where, if I'm sure most of you are unaware, it basically follows this young woman played by Taissa Farmiga, who at the beginning of the movie, we see her and her mother like have an argument, and then she dies in a horrible car accident. And so, like several years later, her and her friends, which include like Aaliyah Shawkat, and Nina Dobrev, and a few others, like are like, hey, we're gonna watch the 30th anniversary screening of your mother's slasher movie, because Malin Ackerman, who plays the mom before this, was in like a classic Friday the 13th style ripoff slasher that they all go to see at this theater. It's called Camp Bloodbath, and they are all like seated for it, and then all of a sudden like a fire breaks out, and they're all like, oh, let's get out of here, and then they are transported into the movie. And it's a very fun sort of parody of these slasher films that's like has a sort of meta contextual touch to it as well. But there's so much I think I love, like particularly the director I want to shout out, Todd Strauss Schusslen, who I've been championing ever since I saw like this, and he also did Harold and Kumar 3D Christmas, and then Isn't It Romantic after this. And I think those movies are some of the best shot comedies I've seen in the modern studio era, where how many times comedies like look just like so drab and dull. It lights up so beautifully when they go into this Camp Bloodbath there. It looks like it feels very like whimsical, but also in a like slasher, like fun Friday the 13th ripoff way where it feels kind of cheap. And there's like fun people in that segment. Like I think it's the only time besides like Righteous Gemstones I've found Adam Devine funny. He has a very fun supporting role as one of the camp counselor guys. Also, Angela Trimber, who's a very underrated actress, plays basically like the scream queen of the movie, who like is alongside Malin Ackerman, where she tries to like at one point scream in order to draw the killer close. It's the bait basically. It's a very fun moment in that movie. But also even the emotional grounding of it really works, where Taissa Farmiga is seeing her mother for the first time in ages as this other character, but she grows to have like a real investment in her, and the two of them have like a fun back and forth, and there's a genuine sweetness to like as the movie goes along, and it's about like, these messages about like, I love my mother and I have this like memento of her forever. Like on the silver screen she's immortalized, even if it's in a cheap dumb slasher movie. She still finds like a weird beauty to that I think really works. This is a great movie. I'm very curious. Bryan, have you even heard of what this movie is? I don't think you have any idea.
I think I might have like seen just like the poster of it or something when it came out, but no, I hadn't heard about it, but it sounds pretty good. I also had like, it's funny you bring up Adam Devine, because I also am in a similar vein of I watched a lot of like Workaholics for some reason, just because it was on super late and I was just not into it. But also, yeah, he's great on like Righteous Gemstones. But the trailer is like playing on like IMDb in the background. It looks great, so I do want to watch it at some point.
Yeah, it's been on my radar forever, and I have not seen it yet. I do need to see this movie. Yeah.
Well, Marcelo, while you got the floor, what's your pick for this week?
So I went with the Atypical Blockbuster. I went down that route, and I thought, okay, Atypical Blockbuster. What about what about atypical blockbusters that have also bombed, that have also maybe have grown a cult following since its release? And I go, oh, I know one. It's my favorite movie of all time. It's Scott Pilgrim versus the World. Came out, bombed. Is a summer movie. Came out mid-August 2010. And yeah, I said this joke earlier. Like, if I were there when Last Action Hero was out in theaters, I would have seen it like 6 times just to say this movie is worth it. Everybody else is dumb. I did that with Scott Pilgrim. I saw that movie, I think, at least 7 times during its initial theatrical run, because I knew its days were numbered in in theaters, because nobody was there to see it. I was there for Scott Pilgrim. But I mean, it's atypical. I mean, it's also sort of meta. It's also sort of like very much playing with the genre of like, in that movie, it does do like action genre, it does do comedy. It plays into the these video game tropes. And I think it's my favorite movie of all time. I think it's so smart. And I could say a lot about Scott Pilgrim, but I'll just say, to me, it's similar to Last Action Hero, where it, every now and then a movie comes into theaters and people just are like, they just don't get it. They don't go to see it, and it takes some time. I kind of always figured maybe in like 10 years people will come around with Scott Pilgrim, and they did, and now everybody loves it. So I was right. So shout out to the guy who saw Last Action Hero like 10 times in theaters. I'm sure that's somebody out there. You were right 30 years ago. So yeah, it happens. Even happens now. So folks out there, if you love a movie and it bombed in the box office, just hold out hope that maybe it'll find the right audience in due time. So yeah, that's my pick. Scott Pilgrim versus the World.
That's an interesting movie. I've only seen it once, I think. And it was like back in like high school, back when I was, discovering like Edgar Wright and watching all of his movies. I've been meaning to rewatch it for so long, and I just haven't gotten around to it. But now I think I'm finally gonna do it.
I'm always worried when somebody watches it and they're like, "This is your favorite movie?" I'm like, "Yeah, it is." I've gone through a few dates where I'm asked that question. "This is your favorite movie?" I'm like, "Yeah, sorry." Brian, I hope you like it whenever you watch. So yeah, I'd say that.
Yeah, I'm excited to watch it.
Yeah, I mean, I have, I guess, a similar story to Marcelo, where like I remember vividly seeing that in a theater when I was still in high school, and I did one of my like double features I did back in the day of not paying for a ticket for the second time, where I watched Scott Pilgrim, and I loved it so much. And I was weirdly also anticipating, I guess a big thing we should mention is the other movie that came out on that same weekend that kind of buried Scott Pilgrim was the initial Expendables movie. That was the competition.
Oh, I remember that.
And I saw both of them, and the come down from Scott Pilgrim versus the World at like, I was, like I said, in high school, so I'm like, this is the best thing I've ever seen. This is so great. As like a young film nerd who was like in love with like the Edgar Wright, like Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz were like my favorite movies at that time. And then the come down from that to the Expendables, which is just like the worst misuse of such like, in theory, a great idea of like, all the action stars are here. Oh, this is what it is. Woof. Yeah, this is barely a thing.
You just unlocked a memory in my head, Thomas. You see me grimacing on screen here, but oh god, I remember that now. The Expendables coming out that same weekend, and I think Scott Pilgrim came in at number 5 that weekend in terms of box office. So, woof. That's what I was saying.
Yeah, we could be having Scott Pilgrim 4 right now, but no.
Wow, we're not actually, I'm glad that's not happening.
Right,
we got one and done. One masterpiece is enough. Yeah.
My thing with that movie is, as of right now, I should rewatch it. It's been, I don't know, about 5 years since I rewatched it. I think that's one of the best supporting casts I've ever seen in a fucking movie.
Absolutely.
With just like fucking Culkin, Mary Elizabeth Winstead, Anna Kendrick, Aubrey Plaza, like just Jason Schwartzman. Everyone is so on point in that movie. And I think Michael Cera is also very on point. But I've struggled recently with just the Scott Pilgrim character, not necessarily being unlikable. That's not my problem. It's just that, like, I don't know if I give a shit about Scott as a character really at all either way. And I think that's always been that was my struggle, at least the last time I rewatched. I'd be curious to revisit it and see if I maybe have a bit more inclination to. I still really like that movie. But I think it kind of fits with, I talked with Bryan about this before, the non-Simon Pegg co-written Edgar Wright movies, I think, are his weakest movies. I think some are worse than others. Like, I like Baby Driver. Last Night in Soho is a movie that exists. And, yeah, I don't know. But still definitely, I would say, of that crop, it's the best one, for sure.
I mean, all I'll say is, I'm glad Scott Pilgrim exists. That's what I'll say about Edgar Wright.
Of course.
Edgar Wright, I love you, but I'm glad that happened. I'm still looking forward to your next project, Edgar, so thank you.
Well, on that note, let's briefly repeat our titles here, in case you missed them, you want to add to your watch list or whatever. Bryan?
Yes, I had the Ivan Reitman 1988 film Twins with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito.
And I had the underrated little meta horror comedy that you all should seek out, underrated gem of The Final Girls from 2015.
And I had Edgar Wright's 2010 atypical box office bomb, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World.
And now we'll be doing the close of this show, this big gun of an episode that's been going on for quite a bit. But we want to thank some people. Of course, we want to thank Burial Grid for doing our intro and outro music. Purchase this music at burialgrid.com. Thanks to Michelle Kyle for our artwork. Find her at MishKyle96 on Twitter. I'll still say that's what I'm going to say.
Oh, yeah.
Follow her on Twitter. And then thanks, of course, to our patrons over at patreon.com/cinema2letter, where every, month you just donate $1 and you get access to a bunch of stuff, including, we'll be going on our hiatus for a bit until the end of September when we come back with new episodes. But in the meantime, so much on the Patreon that you can listen to of Bryan and I reviewing recent movies. Like, we would have released fairly recently our TMNT Mutant Mayhem audio review. You could hear us talk about that. Also, at some point during August, we'll have our bonus episode that we're planning on doing, which is an audio commentary for Shrek. That's what we're doing. We're going to be doing a full-length audio commentary on the redefining genre classic Shrek.
Absolutely.
That we'll have plenty of things to say about, I'm sure. And then also, around the time this episode is going to be coming up, we should announce that our next series, which we're going to be doing, is going to be horror-driven. Because it's going to come out, late September is our first episode, run through October, all the way to Halloween. If everything goes well, will be the last episode of that season. And we're still contemplating the schedule, but as we've talked about before, patrons get to vote for a certain one for every miniseries, at least one episode. And for that horror miniseries, you all get to vote for the N for New pick, so a recent release from the last couple years. And you all get to pick between the 2020 Lee Winnell directed Invisible Man movie, and then the very recent, earlier this year, horror movie Skinamarink, which I know Marcelo's seen both of these.
Holy crap! I'm a patron of you guys, and I'm already having a hard time deciding between those two. Those two are great picks, in my opinion.
Yes, I'll be very curious, because I know, Bryan, you liked that Invisible Man from 2020, but I know you haven't seen Skinamarink. You want to, but you're kind of a bit scared.
So I absolutely adore The Invisible Man from 2020. That's a great movie. But my biggest thing with Skinamarink is that I've only heard people talk about it on Twitter, and all I can see is it sounds just like scary, house stuff, and kind of scary stuff in the dark, which is sort of stuff that in real life actually scares me. I still have an irrational fear of the dark. So it was a movie I had watched, I had seen screenshots and people talking about it, and I was like, maybe I'll just skip that one, but I will be willing to sit through it if the patrons decide for it.
I mean, can I just say, if we end up doing Skinamarink, Bryan, it's a movie that I saw in theaters, and I would have trouble seeing it at home because it is an experience that I think the proper way to see it at home would be at midnight, close all the blinds, turn off all the lights, turn on the movie, and throw away your phone and just experience it. I think that's the only way to do it at home. But if that sort of stuff gets you, though, watch it at noon and do it that way. But yeah, I'm excited either way. Those two are great movies.
And I'll just add, as a jaded horror fan who loves horror, but at the same time, it's I've seen a lot of horror movies. Not a lot scares me. Skinamarink literally had me pulling child shit of I had a little wool cap because it was cold back in February, and I was just hiding behind it at one point. It got me down to that sensory level of just oh god, this is so fucking creepy. But they'll be on the patrons' hands. You'll have, it'll probably be the Wednesday after this comes out, if you're listening, the 16th of August. It'll be up for a couple days until through the weekend is usually how we'll be going with the polls. So you'll have that amount of time to vote. All that for $1 over at the Patreon. But of course, we also want to thank, speaking of patrons, as he so mentioned here, Marcelo, thank you so much for being the first guest, breaking open that guest jar. Thank you so much for coming on. Please plug yourself. Where can people find you on the internet?
Let me say thanks, guys, for having me on. This was fun. You can find me, over at talkfilmsociety.com. Check out all the podcasts there, including this one, Cinema to the Letter. Good job, listeners, for listening to this. But yeah, you can listen to It Pod to Be You, hosted by Manish Mathur, and also the podcast I do with Siobhan Irving. We were recently doing a little series on summer blockbusters, as of this recording, I just released our Barbenheimer episode where we talked about Barbie and Oppenheimer. Go back, listen to that catalog of episodes and all the rest over at talkfilmsociety.com, and also Patreon. Go to patreon.com/talkfilmsociety for bonus episodes, commentaries. Thomas features on the Malignant commentary we did months and months ago. But yes, check that out over on our Patreon. And that's it. Thanks, guys.
Yes, I want to shout out with those recent episodes. I listened to not the Barbenheimer one, but the speaking of two movies that came out on the same date, of The Dark Knight and Mamma Mia.
Oh yeah,
which was a very interesting episode. I was very fascinated by that one.
Well, thank you. Yeah, me and Siobhan have fun, and that was a fun episode. And I think the Barbenheimer one is just as fun. So yeah, thanks, Thomas.
And on that note, you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I'll still say Twitter. For now, over there, at Cinema 2 Letter, and I guess any other social media platforms we might go to in the future, perhaps, maybe by the time our next miniseries starts, and things are just, unusable on a certain website that's called Twitter. And then, once again, any place at Cinema 2 Letter, and you can also find me on Twitter and Letterboxd, but also very recently, I managed to get an invite code for Blue Sky. I'm over there now. Damn. Finally, I managed to get I have the in case of emergency break glass just in time, really. It was right before the X thing got announced. I'm woof, thank God this fucking happened. But any social media platform, pretty much, I'm at Not The Who's Tommy. And I also do some writing, both at marianithomas.wordpress.com and over at film-cred.com. And shout out while I'm talking about Film Cred, I do the Film Cred review show. I produce that, and Kyle Peralta hosts it. I will be on the show, actually speaking. I'm usually behind the camera on that, or behind the mic that's muted, whatever. Over there, where we'll be talking about sort of a summer post-mortem. Because I do this with Kyle the last couple of years, where at the beginning of the summer we predict about what's gonna be interesting, what's gonna be good. And this is the first time we're gonna be doing a post-mortem, and of all the summers to do a post-mortem on, this is a fascinating one. I'm sure. So I'm sure she says very interesting things, and I'm there too. But you can listen to that and become a patron over for Film Cred. And one last time, since this will be the last episode of August, I will be at DragonCon once again over in downtown Atlanta. I do panels usually over there. I'm probably going to put in an audio clip right here of my schedule that's finalized by this time in August. Yes, that is accurate, Nostradamus. Hello, everyone. As my past self mentioned, this is Thomas from the future. Specifically August 14th, 2023, here to just put in a little soundbite just to tell you my schedule for the upcoming DragonCon, which will be in downtown Atlanta, Labor Day weekend, August 30th through September 4th. And I'll be doing 6 panels. Keep in mind, most of these will be at the Westin, one of the 5 major hotels, on the horror track. Most of these will be. Most of them will be in the Peachtree 1-2 at the Westin, which is a specific location. I go up a couple escalators, but you'll find us there. And I'll mention there's one slightly different room for one of these panels that's like right beneath the Peachtree Westin. But here we go. On Thursday, August 31st at 7 p.m., you got No Return, the Yellow Jackets fan panel, all about the Showtime show that's all the rage with the kids, the Melanie Linskys and Christina Ricci's and Juliette Lewis's and whatnot. That'll be, once again, at 7 p.m., August 31st. I'll be talking all about Yellow Jackets. Then on Friday, September 1st at 4 o'clock p.m., I'll be doing 2023 in horror, the year so far. So any recent horror movies that have come out since January 1st, 2023, that tickle our fancy, we'll be talking about. You can add some of those to your watch list if you come over on September 1st at 4 o'clock p.m. for that. Then the next one I have, Friday, September 1st at 10 p.m., is Living Among Us, Good Omens 2. So the second season of Good Omens, that will be at the Chastain 1-2, which is right below the Peachtree 1-2, as part of the Urban Fantasy track. I guess Marcelo J. Pico might be interested by that name. Yes, the Chastain, kind of like Jessica, she has not come over yet to Dragon Con. We would love to host a panel with her, specifically in that room if possible. But yeah, so that'll be September 1st at 10 o'clock p.m., just below the Peachtree. And the rest of these will be at the Peachtree 1-2, which includes Saturday, September 2nd at 4 o'clock, Decoding M. Night Shyamalan. All about M. Night, your Sixth Senses, your Splits, but also some of the non-horror movies like, The Unbreakable, Glass. Just talking about all his movies and decoding what that guy, kind of his specific style we'll be talking about. From like Praying with Anger all the way to Knock at the Cabin, all of it's eligible to be talked about. Once again on Saturday, September 2nd at 4 o'clock p.m. Then Breaking Taboo, a discussion on classic horror movie censorship. That'll be Saturday, September 2nd at 8:30. So we'll be talking about roughly pre-MPAA censorship of horror films. So, earlier stuff from, the silent era all the way to like Hammer classics and such. And that'll be once again Saturday, September 2nd, 8:30 p.m. And then my last panel, which will be on Sunday, September 3rd at 7 o'clock p.m., Burn to Light, Vampires in Classic Cinema. Once again, within that rough 1968 being the cutoff date of just vampiric depictions. So you'll be able to see any of those, and if you want to either scroll back and make sure you got all the dates right, or just download the Dragon Con app and look up my name as a presenter, you'll be able to find all those panels I'm doing, add them to your schedule, make it a lot easier for you just to download that app and do that. And also keep in mind if there are any changes, because this was tentative as of right now, as of August 14th, so if there are any changes, they'll be noted in the Dragon Con app. If I'm on a panel, if I'm not on a panel, anything's been added or subtracted, you'll be able to find that out. And now for the rest of the season finale, as previously recorded, take it away. Come say hi. Love hearing people who have any interest in what I do.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. I'm going down with the shit boys at BRYANDRADE 3, and then you can also follow me on Letterboxd, see what movies and lists I'm making at my name, Bryan Andrade, ANDRADE is my last name, and yeah, follow me on there.
And for more of us, stay tuned for the next mini-series where we're going to be doing horror. Just, subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or other podcasting platforms. And if you're listening on Marcelo's Great Talk Film Society Network, like he said, listen to all the other great shows that are on there. And you can also dig into our archives on our Podbean feed for various episodes of this show, this whole first season, and then also all the stuff from Double Edge Double Bill prior to that. And nothing else. If you can't support the show monetarily, that's cool. The free way to help us out is to rate, review, or simply share the show around to give us more visibility. Maybe if you are rich and opulent, and you want to donate to the Patreon and say, put our logo on a big giant fucking spaceship in the sky, we'll take that too. That's a nice gesture. That might help for us, right? Yeah, that'll be great. If you have that money, please do. And then, yeah. So, like I said, this is the end of this Blockbuster miniseries. Can you believe it, Bryan? The season's over, and we're going to be taking, our main feed break. That's true, we did it. And we're going to foolhardily try more. As I said, the first episode for the horror stuff will be coming out September 26th, and we'll finalize. We might put up like a little bonus thing at some point on the feed to announce maybe what our titles will be. That should
that'd be
expect
fun.
that maybe around like September at some point. We'll announce that as we get closer to the date, and we'll reveal our schedule and everything. But yeah, until then, everybody, it's time for the curtains to close and for us to leap out of the screen or your pod or your phone. I guess, is that what we're doing?
Death is going to leap out of everyone's phones right now.
Hasta la vista, baby.
Hasta la vista, baby, sure. Hasta la vista, babies.